The rat monster came apart in a bolt of fire, and before the light of it had finished dying, Alicia was already snapping at the porter to move. The creature dissolved into pale sparks and left one drop on the cold stone. Under the floating mage light, the small figure the party called Cole started forward on aching legs. 3 bags rode on that thin frame, one on the back, one on each shoulder, and every one of them was full. Nobody in the dungeon knew the truth of the porter hauling their loot. Nobody knew Cole was a girl named Violet, 16 and slight, dressed as a boy because a boy could get hired and a weak girl could not. The world only saw the strange left eye, flat and black, where the right one was clear blue, and the world had decided long ago that the eye was worthless. Alicia kicked her in the back and told her to hurry, to stop being slow, to stop being useless. Violet caught her balance and said, as softly as she could, that she truly could not fit one more thing, that the bags were full, that her arms had nothing left. I can't, she managed. I'm sorry, there's no more room. That was when Hugo took a fistful of her hair and hauled her up onto her toes. He wanted to know how a useless like her dared talk back to the people generous enough to feed her. Then, because it pleased him, he made her recite his skill aloud like a lesson. Advanced swordsman, 3 times the speed and the strength with a blade in his hand. Violet said it exactly, the way she said it every day. He sneered and asked what pathetic skill she had. Cornered, she gave it up in a whisper, the otherworld eye, and then ashamed the rest of it, that all it did was turn her left eye black when it stirred, and nothing more that anyone had ever found. Alicia laughed. A skill that only blackened one eye, she said, was not merely useless, but a special kind of creepy, the sort of thing that made your skin crawl for no return at all. Hugo shook her by the hair until she folded and apologized, and kept apologizing, swallowing the tears she would not let fall. She had learned a long time ago that the apology was the fastest way to make it stop, so she gave it. She let the strap settle back onto the raw place on her shoulder, and she counted the drops in the bags by feel in the dark, the way she had taught herself to do, and she kept the black eye down where no one could laugh at it. 3 months. 3 months she had done this, every day, for the Grey Road party. She had no appraisal skill, so on her own time, she memorized the drops by hand, studied every dull stone, and dropped trinket until she knew them cold, because knowing them was the one thing that was hers. Somewhere under the fear of being cast out with nothing to send home, a small, hard part of her had never quite agreed with the world's verdict. She never let that part surface. She only fed it, quietly, one memorized drop at a time. They pushed deeper, and the haul kept growing. A healing potion, a bracelet that hummed with a defense charm, a pair of shoes with a faint purple glow on them, which meant they were worth real money, several gold coins for the lot, though Violet's cut would be a few thin silver at most. Hugo caught her hair again, held it a breath, and let go, just a reminder of where she stood. Then Miles stepped in, smooth and quiet, the youngest and smallest of the party, and the one who always played kind. He asked which of the drops were the valuable ones. He offered, mildly, to carry the shoes himself, so her load would be lighter, help with a small hook buried inside it. Alicia said she had better be grateful for a favor like that. Then she burned down another monster and pointed at the fresh drop on the ground, waiting. Violet went to gather it, and somewhere under the gratitude, a question she never let herself finish drifted up. Why would a real C-rank party ever bother hiring a porter as weak and useless as her? She had no answer. She did not chase it. She ran perhaps 10 paces to collect the scattered loot, and the uneven stone caught her foot. She went down hard. One of the bags tore open and its contents scattered across the floor. Hugo laughed and called her rubbish among rubbish. Not just a rubbish skill, he said, but a rubbish person all the way through. Alicia's voice went sharp. She wanted to know if the fool had just crushed the valuable items, and she ordered her to pick every piece up fast. Violet reached for the nearest drop, and her right hand would not close. She had heard it in the fall. The fingers trembled and refused, and a dull heat spread through the palm. She tried again anyway, scraping at the stone. Miles watched, calm and unbothered, and noted that all this delay was drawing monsters toward them now. The danger, he said, was coming, and he did nothing at all. Something dropped from the black ceiling. A giant spider landed almost on top of her, legs folding down around her, and Violet screamed for help. Miles answered first. He would save her, he said pleasantly, but not for free. Her whole day's wages would do it. 10 silver, not the usual one. She hesitated, and the hesitating tore at her, because every one of those coins was already spoken for. That money went home. Her family in their poor rural cottage lived on what she sent, and here was a man asking her to trade all of it just to keep breathing. She never got to answer. Alicia's arm snapped up. pointing past her, and Hugo shouted at everyone to run. A swarm was pouring into the corridor, blood-drinking bats, a living tide of them, so many that even the giant spider turned and fled in terror. Then the party did the thing the whole story would never forgive. Alicia raised her hand, and a wall of fire went up across the corridor. It came from the floor and climbed to the ceiling in a single breath, a curtain of roaring light, so bright after the cave dark that it stamped itself white across Violet's vision. The heat of it rolled over her face. For half a heartbeat, she felt saved. A wall of fire between her and the swarm was a wall of safety, and her whole body reached toward it. Then she understood which side of it she was on. The flames had not gone up in front of her. They had gone up behind her. They sealed her in with the monsters and put the Grey Road party safe on the far side. And through the shimmer and warp of the heat, she watched the three shapes she had served for 3 months turn their backs and walk away into the dark. She did not scream after them. Some part of her had known this was coming since the first day. Alicia's parting words reached her muffled through the fire, and Violet only half heard them. That the girl had no one to blame but herself, and a small light laugh, as if a monster this weak had never once been worth a second thought, even when they were children. The wall held its bright line. On the other side of it, the wings kept coming, thick and close, a sound like rain that would not stop. And the small figure the party had used up and thrown down stood alone in the red light, with her hurt hand held against her chest, breathing hard, waiting to find out how it would feel to be eaten. A bat found her first. It clamped onto her, and she felt the pull of it, and warm blood welled at her brow and ran down into her left eye. And the eye woke. For the first time in her life, the otherworld eye did something. Over the dark shape rushing toward her through the swarm, strange text bloomed, words only she could read, floating clean above the chaos, naming what came. Something like a Westerner, it said. Striking looks. She had no time to wonder what that meant, because the shape was a man, huge and armored, cutting straight through the tide. He tore the swarm apart with a heavy sword, and the bats scattered from him like sparks off an anvil. He reached her, caught her before she dropped, and gave her a rough shake to see whether she was still alive. "Hey, you with me?" His voice was low and worried and warm. He looked her over, saw the answer he wanted, and let out a breath. Good. He was about 30, she thought dimly, in fine heavy armor, the kind of gear only a top hunter wore. He looked around the empty floor with plain bafflement and asked why in the world a kid was down this deep, alone, with no one else in sight. Half conscious, bleeding, saved by a stranger, Violet did the only thing 3 months had taught her to do. She remembered the loot. She fumbled one of the scattered drops up off the stone with her good hand and held it out to him, because gathering it was her job, and her job was the only worth she had. The swarm was gone. The quiet came back slowly, and with it, her voice. She thanked him for saving her life. Then she pressed the drop into his hand, a ring the bats had left, and told him plainly what it was. "This raises attack power by 3, she said. He went still. A porter, naming a drop on sight. He crouched down to her level and asked, careful now, whether she had the appraisal skill. The lie was already waiting. It was the only armor she had. She said no, that she just studied drops until she knew them, because she had no appraisal and never would. She let the black eye stay a secret. She had learned to guard it the way she guarded her name. He didn't push. He just started gathering. Every scattered drop went into her torn bag. The ring, the potions, the trinkets, and the loot from the monsters he himself had killed on the way in. Then he told her to keep all of it and would not hear a word against it. He told her his name was Roland and asked for hers. She gave him Cole first, the way she gave it to everyone, because Cole was the name that kept her safe and fed. But something in the plain size of his kindness pried the truth loose, and she heard herself say the rest of it so softly it barely left her mouth. "Violet," she whispered. "My name is Violet, after a blue flower." The name her mother had given her for the blue of her good eye. The name she had buried under the boy so long that saying it aloud felt dangerous and precious at once, like setting down something she was never supposed to hold. Roland grinned, set it back to her once, and clasped a silver bracelet with a round stone onto her wrist. Before she could refuse, before she could try to hand any of it back, he touched the stone and the dungeon folded away around her. She came back into the world, standing in daylight at the dungeon's mouth, alone and whole. For a moment, she just breathed the open air. Then she turned the bracelet on her wrist and understood, slowly, that he had lied to her the way kind people lie. A teleport bracelet like this was worth 10 gold coins on its own, and he had let slip that it came from a monster that dropped a whole match set of 10 at once, which meant the pieces could very likely carry messages between the ones who wore them. He had given her something far greater than he pretended. She could not keep it. She could not keep any of what wasn't hers. So she knelt in the cold morning light and began sorting the bag, careful and slow with her hurt hand, trying to separate Roland's share from her own so she could give his back. At the very bottom, under everything, her fingers closed on a tiny chest, no bigger than her palm. A chest usually meant treasure. Her tired heart lifted a little, in spite of everything, and she worked the small lid open with her thumb. Inside sat an ugly, dull brown lump. No shine, no glow, no shape worth a name. It was the color of nothing, the texture of nothing, the kind of worthless-looking thing that made a porter's heart drop straight back down, the kind of thing the whole bright world would glance at once, decide was garbage, and throw away without a second look. 3 months of memorizing every drop on the continent, and she had no name for it at all. Her thumb almost tipped it out onto the dirt. Then the small cut at her brow seeped, and a single bead of blood slid warm down the side of her nose and into her left eye, and the eye woke. The world went quiet at its edges. Over the ugly little lump, patient as a candle held in a still room, the strange text rose, the way it had risen over the man in the swarm, only slower now and gentler, with nothing trying to kill her. Clean lines, certain, impossible. A true name, printed in a language from a world this one had never known and never once named, floating steady above a thing everyone else on Earth would have thrown in a ditch. It said the lump was a seasoning. It said the seasoning was called red miso. Violet knelt very still in the dawn, with the open chest cupped in both hands, and the word hanging in the air of her ruined left eye. She did not know what miso was. She had never heard the word in her life, but she knew, the way you know weather, 3 things at once, and they arrived so quietly that they did not feel like the turning point they were, that no appraiser on the whole continent could have read this, not one of them, not with the finest skill money could buy, that the world had walked straight past it, the very way the world had always walked straight past her, and that here it was anyway, resting in the hands of the one useless girl whose one useless eye could look at a piece of garbage and find, waiting inside it, a name. She closed her fingers around the lump called miso. For the first time in 3 months, she did not feel like something to be thrown away. For a little while, kneeling in the dawn with the ugly lump warm in her fist, Violet let herself believe the worst was behind her. Then, boots came up out of the dark behind her, and the quiet broke. The party climbed out of the dungeon one by one, brushing ash from their sleeves, and they looked at her the way you look at a stain that somehow hasn't come out. Alicia said something light and surprised, a joke about the porter still breathing. Hugo laughed. None of them asked how she had lived. None of them looked at the dried blood down her left eye long enough to wonder about it. Miles crouched in front of her, gentle as ever, and set 2 fingers against the cut at her brow. A thin warmth ran through it. The bleeding stopped. For half a breath, she almost thanked him. The reflex was that deep in her. Then he told her, in that same soft voice, that there would be no pay today. Nothing. She had cost them a delve. She nodded. She had learned a long time ago not to argue with that voice. It was Alicia who noticed the drops. The small rings and charms Roland had pressed into her bag, glinting where the flap had fallen open. Alicia scooped them out, turning a pale ring to the light, cooing over it like a thing she might keep. Anything the party's porter carried, she announced, belonged to the party. That was simply how it worked. Violet's hands came up before her fear could stop them. Please, those aren't mine to give away. Her voice shook, but it held. The man who saved my life gave them to me. I have to give them back to him. Please. The hall of the dungeon went very still. Hugo crossed to her in 2 strides and took her by the collar and lifted, so her toes scraped the stone. He did not shout. He leaned close and twisted the words in her mouth into something ugly, that a rat like her must be planning to run her mouth all over the guild, telling everyone the brave Grey Road party had turned tail and fled from a few bats, which was exactly what they had done. She could see him knowing it. She could see how much he needed her not to say it. She shook her head, fast, the collar cutting into her throat. She wouldn't. She only wanted the rings returned to the right hands. Alicia's eye dropped to the small chest by Violet's knee, a palm-sized thing, dull and ugly, the kind of drop nobody bothered to open. She flicked it up with the toe of her boot, sneered that it was a dud, worthless, fit for the worthless, and threw it. It caught Violet on the cheekbone, not hard, just enough to say what they thought of her. Miles rose, dusted his knees, and delivered the verdict in his even, reasonable way, as though it were a favor. There was no point keeping her. They were letting her go. Consider it a kindness. Hugo opened his hand and dropped her. She landed on the cold stone in the gold light, and the 3 of them turned and walked toward the road as if she had already stopped existing. She stayed down until the sound of them was gone. Then Violet did the strange thing she always did. She reached out and she picked up the ugly little chest that had been thrown at her face. Her left eye gave the faintest pull, a warmth behind it, there and gone. And something in the lump inside seemed to lean toward her, the way the last thing had. She didn't open it. She didn't dare. Not here. Not with her hands shaking. She only knew, the way she was starting to know these things, that the world had thrown this away too, and that it had landed with her. She slid it into her pocket beside the other one. Two worthless things nobody else could see. Then she wiped her face, got her feet under her, and started the long walk into town. The guild would have work. The guild had to have work. She needed to eat. She needed to send money home. There was nothing else to do but try. The guild hall was a great stone room, hung all over with little paper requests, and Violet stood at the edge of it feeling smaller than the smallest note on the wall. She made herself walk to the counter. She would take anything, she had decided. The lowest party, the worst delve. She only needed someone to let her carry. The receptionist behind the counter was a woman named Hannah, older, sharp-eyed, a former adventurer who had clearly seen every kind of person try every kind of story. She cut Violet off before the question was even out. There was no party here to introduce her to, not one. Violet gave the name on her license, Cole. Hannah's gaze went straight to the black eye and stayed there, and her mouth thinned. She named Violet by it instead, the porter with the one dead eye, as though the registered name were an obvious lie a girl like this would tell. Then she laid the real thing on the counter, flat and cold. A report had been filed. Cole, it said, had embezzled drop items from the party that hired her. For a moment, Violet simply didn't understand the shape of the words. I would never take anything. Her hands found the edge of the counter. There's been a mistake, please. I gave them back. Behind her, laughter. The Grey Road party had come in off the road and settled at the dining tables, and now they drifted over to watch, easy and unhurried. The way people watch a thing they've arranged. Hugo didn't even bother to hide it. He asked, grinning, whether she'd forgotten already who it was that reported her, as if it were the funniest thing in the world that the trap had a name on it and the name was his. Alicia leaned on the wall and backed the lie without a wrinkle in her smile. There were witnesses, she said. People who had seen the porter trying to pocket the drops right outside the dungeon. Hannah gave a short nod. The guild had looked into it, and the account held together. It held together because 3 ranked adventurers said it did, and Violet was a nobody with a cursed eye. She tried anyway. She told them the truth, that the drops had come from the hunter who saved her, that she had carried nothing away that wasn't meant to go straight back to him, that she had never in 3 months taken so much as a copper that wasn't hers. The words came out too fast and too small, and not one person in that hall leaned in to catch them. Hannah delivered it like a sentence, because it was one. The porter's license, revoked. No guild in the town would put her on a party again. Something went out of Violet's legs. She caught the counter. She was crying now, and she hated it. Hated how it made her look exactly like what they said she was, but she couldn't stop, and the pleading came out raw and childish and true. She needed to work. She needed to eat. She had people at home who ate because she worked. Please, please, there had to be something. Hannah told her to leave the guild. The party laughed at her back as she folded over the counter, and the whole bright room went on around her, as if a girl coming apart at the front desk were simply the weather. She didn't hear the door. She heard the room change. The murmur near the entrance dropped and shifted the way a crowd moves when something large comes through it, and then a shadow fell over the counter, and a voice she knew cut clean across the noise. "Why are you crying, kid?" Violet looked up into Roland's face. He was exactly as enormous as she remembered, armor and all, filling the space in front of the counter like a door had opened onto weather. And he was looking at her, actually looking, the way almost no one in this room had, with a plain, gathering frown. The whole story came out of her in pieces. She'd lost her license. They said she stole, and the drops she was supposed to have stolen were his, the ones he had put in her bag. Only now they were being used as the proof against her, and she was so sorry. She'd only ever wanted to give them back and pay him with what she earned. Roland let her finish. Then he turned to the counter, and he said it for the whole hall to hear. Those drops were a gift. He had stuffed them into the kid's bag himself, with his own hands, and he had meant her to keep everyone. There was no loan. There was nothing to steal. You cannot embezzle a present. Hannah's professional calm held, but only just. She pushed back the way a rule-bound person does when the rules are the last floor under them, suggesting, stiffly, that a clever child might invent a sad story to win the sympathy of a famous hunter. So Roland reached for the rule itself. He asked her to say the ownership law out loud. Who does a drop belong to? And Hannah, cornered by her own procedure, had to answer. The drop belongs to whoever felled the monster, not the porter who carries it, the one who made the kill. Then by that law, Roland said, those drops were his to give. Giving them broke nothing, and he had a question of his own now. He wanted to file a theft report because someone had taken his property out of this kid's hands. Who was it? Who had pulled an S-rank's drops off a porter and called them their own? Violet, small and shaking, added the thing she thought would only make it worse, that afterward she had sorted every drop from memory and could still name which beast each one came from and exactly what it did, because she had no appraisal and had taught herself to remember. She said it like a confession. Roland looked at her for a moment, as though she'd told him she could pull down the moon, and something in his face went quieter and more dangerous. Hannah had gone still. Violet watched her do the arithmetic. The accusers were the party at the dining tables. They had sworn they didn't know who the hunter was, but the hunter was Roland, an S-rank whose name traveled ahead of him into every hall in the region. You did not fail to know Roland. You only pretended not to. And then the last piece, the one that took the color out of Hannah's face. Roland said, plainly, that when he found this kid, she was alone. Deep in the dungeon, walled off, not one member of any party within reach of her. He had pulled her out of a swarm that her own people had left her to. The counter was very quiet. Hannah looked at the crying porter she had just tried to throw out, and at the drops she had believed were stolen, and at the three adventurers laughing at the tables who had told her a clean, simple, false story. Then she sent a runner across the hall to summon the Grey Road party to the counter. Alicia reached the counter first, and she was still smiling. Violet saw it, that she'd read Roland's arrival completely wrong, that she thought an S-rank crossing a crowded hall toward the Grey Road party could only mean glory, an invitation, a great man come to be seen with them. The smile lasted until she got close enough to see his face. Then it came apart by degrees, like frost off a window. Hugo swaggered up behind her, still chewing, and threw a sneer at the small porter standing half behind Roland. Surprised, he made sure everyone heard that the useless boy had the nerve to show up here at all. Roland didn't shout. That was the thing Violet would remember. He asked one flat, even question, and the room leaned in to hear it. The drop from the vampire bat he had killed and handed to their porter to carry. Where was it? Why had it turned up in the Grey Road party's own hall instead of going back to the man who made the kill? Hugo lied first, the fast, reflexive lie of a man who lies for a living. He knew nothing about any bat, any drop. Then Roland named the item, named it exactly, down to what it did. And the lie died in Hugo's mouth with the whole hall watching it die. Miles bowed his head and mumbled something about a misunderstanding. It was the closest that smooth, careful man had ever come to looking cornered. Roland laid it out for the room, one plain sentence at a time. A drop belongs to whoever fells the beast, no matter whose bag it rides in. They had taken his, quietly, and then used what they stole to brand the child who carried it a thief. That was when Hannah found her voice and turned it, for the first time, against the people she had believed. There was a second charge, she said, and she was the one adding it now. Leaving a porter with no way to fight alone in a dungeon and walking out was a serious breach. And there was no emergency report. None, she had checked the record herself, that would have made such a thing forgivable. Hugo lunged at that, desperate, trying to dress the abandonment up as heroism, a run for help, a brave dash to fetch a rescue. But there was no filed report to stand under the story, and it fell in front of everyone, and the hall began, low, to murmur. And then it was Violet who nearly undid it, because someone pushed her to speak, and old habit answered before sense could. She said she was sorry. She said she understood she was only ever half a hand because of her worthless skill, and that of course her pay was small, only a tenth, because what was a broken porter worth? Roland's patience broke, not at her, over her. He rounded on the counter and the room and said it loud enough to reach the back wall, that a skill had nothing to do with what a porter was owed, that the law set the floor at a full share or 2/10 at the very least, and this child had been handed 1/10 of what she hauled with her own back and taught to thank them for it. And this guild, he said, had come within a breath of tearing up her license on the word of the very people who robbed her. The murmur turned. Violet could hear it happen, the whole weight of the room sliding off her and onto the three at the counter, the sound a crowd makes when it decides who the liar is. She waited for the rest, for someone to take Hugo by the arm, for the word to come down that would make it even, make it real, make 3 months of it finally cost them something. It didn't come. Hannah recorded a formal reprimand and a black mark against the Grey Road name, and there it stopped. No one was seized, no sentence fell. A reprimand sat one full step short of any real penalty, and in that hall, on that day, the harder step simply was not taken. The three of them gathered their things under the eyes of a room that now knew exactly what they were, and walked out on their own 2 feet, stung and sullen, and utterly unrepentant, muttering that it was all a misunderstanding, that they'd been generous to the brat, that the boy ought to be grateful. The debt walked out the door with them. Everyone in the hall could feel it hanging there, unpaid. Violet did not feel avenged. She stood at the counter with her ugly little chest in her pocket and her face still wet. And what she mostly felt was that she had caused a terrible amount of trouble for a great and important man over a girl who wasn't worth it. But her drops were hers again. The rings, the charms, all of it, back on her own account by the ownership law, and Roland refusing every offer to take his share back the way he'd refused it in the dungeon. And Hannah, behind the counter, would not quite meet her eye, a woman looking at how close she had come to being the one who broke her. Roland set one huge hand on the crown of Violet's head. Careful, the way you'd steady something small, and told her, gruffly, that they were not done, that a kid this sharp with drops was wasted crying at a counter. Violet didn't understand yet what he meant. She only knew, standing in the wreckage of the worst morning of her life, that for the second time in a single day, someone had looked straight at her and refused, out loud, to call her worthless. She still didn't believe them, but she was starting to want to. The coin bag hit Violet in the chest before she saw it thrown. Hugo didn't look at her when he did it. He muttered something low and grudging on his way past, that this squared them, that she should count it and be done. And the words came out sideways, the way a man talks when the apology is being pulled out of him by the guild and not by anything in his own chest. Alicia and Miles didn't even manage that much. They gathered their gear and slipped for the door, still grumbling that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion, that a porter ought to be grateful someone had hired her at all. Then they were gone, and nothing between them and Violet was mended. It had only been marked paid on a page. Roland watched them leave and turned to the counter. He told Hannah plainly that a letter of apology from the guild meant nothing on its own. If she wanted to make the guild's part right, she would find Cole real work, at fair pay, and she would do it herself. Hannah, still red to the ears, agreed on the spot. She would take whatever the guildmaster handed her for mishandling the case. A docked wage, most likely. And she would place the boy somewhere honest. Violet heard the word docked and moved before she could think. "Please don't punish her," she said, both hands coming up. "She didn't do anything. Nobody really did anything wrong." Roland laughed under his breath, low and helpless, and dropped one broad hand on the top of her head. He called her a soft-headed little idiot, fond as an insult can be, and told her he wasn't asking anyone to punish anyone. He was asking Hannah to help. That was what undid her. Cruelty Violet could brace for. She had been bracing for it her whole life, but plain decency, offered to her face with no hook in it, went straight through the guard, and her eyes filled before she could stop them. Hannah made a small, flustered sound and drew a scented handkerchief from her sleeve, dabbing at Violet's face, the clear right eye first, and then, without thinking, the flat black left. The instant the cloth crossed the black eye, the eye woke. It had never done that on its own. A word Violet had no business knowing unspooled in the air beside Hannah. Letters from no language anyone had taught her, patient as a candle flame, spelling out some hidden shape of the woman that ordinary sight would never catch. Then it was gone, the eye dark again, as if it had never spoken. Violet flinched and swallowed it whole, the way she swallowed everything. She said nothing. She only wiped her own face and whispered a thank you, and let no one see that the useless eye had just done something no one had ever told her it could. Hannah pulled the guild's records to place her honestly, and stopped at what she found. The boy's drop sales had climbed steadily across 3 months of porter work. She asked how a porter with no appraisal skill managed that. Violet answered the only way she knew, small, apologetic, as if confessing. She had studied. She had learned by heart which monsters dropped what, and how the good pieces looked against the worthless ones, until she could pick value out of a haul by eye and memory alone. It was just effort, she said. It was nothing anyone couldn't do with enough hours. Hannah was quiet for a moment, plainly amazed that anyone would work that hard to make up for a skill the whole world called useless. Then she counted out the back pay Violet had been cheated of, coin by coin, and pushed it across the stone. This was the guild's amends, she said, and had nothing to do with the old party's debt. That account was still open, still unpaid. Violet tried to refuse it, worried that taking more than her plain due would look like a bribe, until Roland's flat, patient stare wore her down. And then Hannah pressed a pack into her arms and insisted under her breath that it was standard issue and absolutely not favoritism. It wasn't standard issue. The moment Violet's hands closed on it, she felt the weight lie to her, a full pack that hung as light as an empty one. room inside for far more than its size should hold. A storage bag, guild registered, warded against theft, the kind of thing made only by rare crafters or dug out of the deep floors, worth a fortune most porters would never touch. She started to give it back on reflex. Hannah waved her off and busied herself with paperwork to hide her face. Before Violet could argue further, Hannah said there was a test first, no job without one. She laid 10 plants along the counter in a neat row and asked which of them were the true herbs used in potions. Violet's stomach dropped. Fail, and there was no work, no place, no money home. She leaned over the row and made herself look. 3 of these are real, she said. 6 are the false ones people mix them up with. 7, no, 6. Her nerves tangled the count for half a breath before she caught it. And this last one, she hesitated over the 10th. I'm sorry, I've never seen it before. I don't know what it is. Roland leaned in beside her, huge shoulder blotting the light, and squinted down the row. He turned 2 of the plants over, held them side by side, and admitted, honestly baffled, that they looked exactly the same to him. Every one of them. He couldn't tell a real herb from a fake if his rank depended on it. Hannah, sure the 10th was just another false herb the boy hadn't happened to study, called across the hall for the guild's appraiser to settle it and be done. Nora came out mildly annoyed at being pulled from her work. She didn't even cross the floor. She stopped 5 or 6 paces off, turned her appraisal on the 10th plant the way she'd done 10,000 times, a glance and a name, and back to her desk. And her whole face changed. She looked again. She appraised it a second time, as if the first reading had to be a mistake, and whatever came back the second time was worse. The board set went out of her shoulders. She came around the end of the counter fast, crossed to Violet, and caught the small porter by both shoulders. Then she turned her skill on the girl herself. Her gaze snagged on the flat black left eye and held there, and the recognition landed hard across her face. She pressed close and demanded to know how a porter with no skill at all had picked out a difference a trained appraiser couldn't see from 6 paces. Violet shrank in her grip and stammered the truth, the leaf veins. On the false herb, they ran one way. On the 10th, they sat just a hair off the usual pattern. She'd never learned to sort by the veins. Everyone judged herbs by the leaf tips, rounded against pointed. She'd only noticed the veins looked wrong, and it wasn't even a real answer, and she was sorry. Nora wasn't listening to the apology anymore. She straightened, and she said the name, and the name stopped the room. The 1,000-year herb. It hung in the air over the counter, and for a moment, no one moved. The plant the porter had flagged with a shrug and an apology. The ugly, ordinary-looking thing the appraiser had almost waved off from across the floor was one of the rarest things the world had a word for. A porter with a skill everyone had spat on had reached out and touched it and known before anyone with a proper gift knew anything at all. Hannah reeled. The 1,000-year herb was said to drop once in 1,000 years, and the last time it had surfaced was 824 years ago. It was not due again for at least another 176. It should not, could not, be lying on her counter. Half hoping it was an error, she called the whole thing dire and rushed for the stairs with Nora at her heels to carry the news up to whoever handled things too large for a front desk. Roland stood where he was a moment longer. He looked at the ugly little plant, and he looked at Violet, and he murmured, low and grim, that if that thing had truly come back this early, it was very bad news. Then he walked out of the guild without another word, gone somewhere inside his own head. Violet stood alone by the counter with the storage bag on her shoulder, ashamed. She had held a legendary thing in her hand and hadn't even recognized it. That, to her, was the part that mattered. Not that she'd found it, only that she hadn't known. So she did the one thing she always did with a gap in what she knew. She went to close it. The temple let commoners study for free, and the old priest they called father listened to her whole nervous request without once looking bored. She wanted to know everything there was to know about the 1,000-year herb. He had a speed reading gift, and he used it, tore through 2 thick books in the time it took her to sit down, then folded his hands and told her what they held. The herb looked almost exactly like the common false herb, he said. It grew in the same places, came from the same sources, and gave itself away only in the faint set of its leaf veins. It appeared for just 3 months in every 1,000 years. In all of recorded history, there had been 4 sightings of it. 4. The last of them so long ago that no living memory reached it. Violet did the arithmetic in her head, and the wrongness of it settled in her chest like cold water. The herb had come generations before it was due. Then the priest told her the rest, gently. The way you set down something heavy. Its healing was 10,000 times an ordinary medicinal herb. It could mend any wound, cure any sickness, so long as the person still drew breath. That was why almost no living soul had ever held one, and why it had a second name, the adjustment herb. She asked what that meant, and he told her. The herb surfaced when a calamity was coming, one great enough to thin the human world, as though the world, deciding to wound itself, grew the cure in the same breath. Every time it had appeared, something had followed. Dungeons opening all at once and spilling stampedes of monsters into the towns. A plague that killed past counting. Harvests failing season on season until whole nations starved. And oldest of all, in the accounts nobody quite believed anymore, the horned ones, said to have fallen out of a torn sky. He drew as he spoke, careful small sketches in the margin of an old record. The starved, the hungry dead, and the horned one with its crown of bone. And beside the drawings, the ancient script stirred, and Violet's black eye woke and read it. Words no scholar in that quiet room could have sounded out rose up plain and patient in front of her, the way they had risen beside Hannah, the way they rose over anything the bright world had walked past. She didn't understand what she was reading. She only knew, the way you know weather, that she could read it and no one else could, and that it was about the thing in the drawing. She didn't tell him. She sat very still and understood, at last, why Hannah had gone white and why Roland had walked out grim. They hadn't been afraid of a rare plant. They'd been afraid of what had always came before. When the priest gently asked whether she'd thought any more about becoming his assistant, she declined, of course. She would only slow him down, she said. She'd only be in the way. She thanked him, quiet, and left. Behind her, alone with his books, the old priest murmured that he would have her for his successor if she'd let him. A girl who learned that fast, who kept that much. She was already down the steps and didn't hear a word of it. Out in the failing light, Violet counted the coins Hugo had thrown at her, because she counted everything. They were wrong. 2 gold coins too many. She stood there turning it over. The extra had to be shares that were never hers. The parts that would have gone to Miles and the others, folded in by mistake, or by something she couldn't quite name. It didn't sit right in her hand. They owed her far more than 2 coins, and she knew it. And still the first thing she thought was that she ought to find a way to give the extra back, because it wasn't clearly hers. And things that weren't clearly hers had always come with a bill attached. She would sort it later. For now, money was money, and she was careful with it. The Commerce Guild stood right beside the Adventurers Hall and handled transfers to distant families, so she went in and arranged to send some of it home to her parents. And because a porter could die easily, and she'd never learned to pretend otherwise, she thought plainly about writing a small will onto her guild card. A dead adventurer's deposit couldn't be drawn out by anyone left behind, so the money would have to be spoken for in advance. Her family then, all of it, to them. The omen sat over the whole errand, quiet and enormous, the way a storm sits over a town that hasn't looked up yet. One thing more before the light went. If something was truly coming, stampedes, the starved, worse, she had no way to guard herself. She was a porter. She couldn't fight. If a battle ever reached as far back as where she stood, she'd have nothing but the bag on her shoulder. So she turned toward the armor shops at the end of the row, meaning to find something light, something she could move in, something that wouldn't be in the way. She had no idea what was waiting for her there. Violet turned the strange helmet over in her hands and could not make the price make sense. It had a single horn curling off one side, ugly as a root pulled from cold ground, and the keeper wanted 1 gold coin for it, which was cheap, far too cheap. She had memorized the whole drop encyclopedia once, all 50,000 entries, one long winter with nothing warmer to hold, and this thing was in none of them. A drop that wasn't in the book was rare. Rare meant real gold, a fistful of it, not one lonely coin. So she asked, small and honest, whether 1 gold was truly all right for something like this. The shop laughed at her. A knot of adventurers by the weapon rack grinned at each other and told the room what everyone there already knew, that amateurs always thought junk was treasure, that you could hand a novice a worthless drop and he would swear it was a crown. The keeper, a neat man with a waxed mustache, smiled the way grown men smile at a slow child. Violet lowered her head and said nothing. She was used to being the fool in the room. She had come here only to buy something light she could move in, a little armor for a porter who could not fight, and the keeper had steered her straight to the ugliest thing on the shelf. Then the door opened, and the whole shop turned like a field of grass in wind. Roland filled the door end to end. The keeper dropped Violet mid-sale and rushed to fawn over him, because an S rank standing in your shop was worth more than any sale on any shelf. But Roland walked past the man and came straight to her, easy as ever, and greeted her by the boy name the world knew her by, Cole. He looked at the horned thing in her hands and made the face of a man who has found his friend eating out of a bin. Then he reached over and tapped it down onto her head, just to see how it sat. It slid. The horn tipped, the rim dropped, and one side of it fell across her right eye, and the world changed. With her blue right eye covered and only the black left one looking, a warmth bloomed behind the dark eye, and a word she had no business knowing floated up over the helmet, patient as a candle. 3 months she had chased the trick of it, when her eye woke and when it stayed shut, and here was the whole answer handed to her by accident on a big man's hand. Close the right, look with the left. That was all it had ever been. The word above the helmet did not say armor. It said, in letters only she could read, cooking pot. Her heart went straight up into her throat. A pot to cook in, the one thing she had wanted longer than she could remember. Roland, meanwhile, had bullied the certificate out of the clerk and read it flat. Plus 3 defense. He snorted and said a common pot gave you +5 just sitting on your head. So this thing was worse at being armor than an honest kettle. A dud. And then, in the plain way of a rich man who has decided a thing, he asked the price and said he would take it. 5 gold coins, the clerk stammered. And Violet's whole small dream tilted in another man's hand. She heard herself speak before she was brave enough to. Hadn't he just said 1 gold? The keeper flinched and blamed her ears. The helmet muffled them. Gold and silver were easy to confuse. Surely she had misheard. Roland leaned on him with nothing but his size and a level stare, and the man folded like wet paper. 5 silver, he said now. Only 5 silver. And that had merely been an opening number to haggle down from anyway. She could not let Roland buy it. She blurted that she would pay 6 silver, right there, more than the man had even asked, and the cornered keeper, desperate to be rid of the whole sinking business, agreed to sell it for the single silver coin he had first mumbled before any of this began. 1 silver. For a pot, she would have emptied her purse to hold. She thanked him, and she meant it. He had found her something light and well-fitting for her work, and let it go for almost nothing. And to Violet, that was kindness. Roland stared at her as though she had begun speaking a language he did not have. Kind? The man had just tried to fleece her for a gold coin. But it isn't in the encyclopedia, she told him. The one printed 10 years ago, the whole of it. She would have remembered. A drop that isn't in the book is rare enough that a collector might pay 10 gold for it. And he had sold it to her for 1 silver. The keeper went white to the lips. Roland threw his head back and roared. He slapped the counter, declared himself a witness that the price was 1 silver and the sale was done, and told her to pay before the man's soul came back into his body. When Violet held out the coin, the keeper only stood there, frozen and gray. So Roland took it from her fingers and pressed it into the man's slack hand himself. It happened twice more before they left, quicker each time. Her eye caught a plain ceramic dish holding a tray of bracelets and named it an earthen pot. And when the keeper waved his own appraisal skill at it and graded it a common nothing, Roland simply lifted out the bracelets, set the pot on his own head like a great solemn fool, and bought that one too. A whole gold coin for a 1 silver piece with no change taken. Because a common drop no one in the shop had ever laid eyes on was not common at all. He would rather trust his own eyes than any skill, he said. 2 cooking pots dressed as helmets walked out of a shop that thought it had won. At the door, the keeper caught her sleeve, pale and pleading now, and begged her to give up portering and come work for him instead. She stammered an apology and fled. Outside, the market lamps were coming up one by one. Roland told her, a laugh still riding under it, that this was a good lesson. See how dangerous it was to lean your whole weight on a single skill. Whatever had darkened his face earlier at the guild, whatever the priest and the pale receptionist had gone so quiet over, he had folded it away for now. Violet had not. It still sat under everything, quiet and unpaid, waiting for a moment she had time to be afraid in. But a girl with 1 silver spent and a pot at last in her bag could only carry so much dread at once. She turned south, toward the forest and its 3 dark cave mouths, and thought about supper. The adventurers who camped these woods never touched what grew in them. They could pay for hot meals in town, so they walked past nuts and mushrooms and wild yams and greens as if the whole forest were only scenery. Violet gathered all of it. She washed it in the stream, built a small fire, and for the first time in her life set her own pot over her own flames. The soup came out warm. It was hers, and it was flat as rainwater because she had no salt, and salt cost coins she did not want to spend. She ate it anyway, with a dented cup and a whittled twig for a spoon, and turned over whether a pinch of salt was worth the money. Then she remembered the lump. She dug the small ugly chest out of her pocket, one of the no-name kind the whole trade called junk chests, the sort everyone swore held nothing but a foul, worthless clot, not even worth the carrying. She had kept it out of habit. She opened it, closed her right eye, and let the black back one look. A word rose over the muck inside, white and certain. Miso, a seasoning. She almost did not believe it. Everyone knew these chests were garbage, but her eye had never once been wrong about what a thing truly was, only about what the world would pay for it. She broke off a spoonful of the ugly stuff and stirred it into the pot, and the word floating over the soup changed as she watched. Miso soup, it read now, light flavor. A second spoonful, and it added, with wild vegetables. She lifted the spoon toward her mouth. Behind her, a branch cracked. Roland stood at the edge of the firelight, and the instant he saw the pot, he doubled over. For one sick heartbeat, she was sure he was laughing at her soup, at the ugly lump, at the beggar's meal a porter had scraped out of weeds. But he was not. He was laughing at the helmet. She had cooked supper in the horned drop she had bought that very afternoon, and the sight of an armor helmet steaming over a campfire with a spoon poking out of it was, to a man who ate in inns, the funniest thing he had met in a year. He patted her head and told her she was the most interesting person he had ever come across, and then, kindly and seriously, that she really ought to sell the rare drop and buy herself a proper pot with the coin. She only blinked at him. Sell it? She had paid 1 silver. It had never once crossed her mind that a thing like this could be sold back for more than you gave. He mentioned in passing that a researcher named Scarlet had once appraised his own helmet for a fine price, the very woman who had written the Great Drop Dictionary, a name he spoke the way you speak of weather far out at sea. Take yours to Scarlet, he said. Violet nodded and let the name drift by. She did not want the woman's gold. She wanted to explain why she loved the pot, that it was light and snug, and gave a little armor to someone too weak to carry a heavy one, but the words tangled in her mouth, and before she could free them, Roland reached over and lifted the pot to ask whether she was going to eat. Her stomach dropped straight through the ground, because the soup in that pot was made of the lump, the thing every camp on the continent threw away, and she simply could not feed a foul, worthless clot to the one man in the world who had ever been kind to her. So she lied. She was full, she said, already ate. He asked, easy as breathing, whether he might finish what was left, and before she could invent a single reason to stop him, he tipped the pot and drank. She watched his face the way you watch a stone fall toward your bare foot. He stopped. He looked down into the pot, and his whole face opened like a door swinging back on a lit room. Delicious, he said, astonished, his mouth still half full, and drank again, deep and again, the broth running warm and brown and rich with a savor no one on this whole continent had ever tasted, because it had waited 1,000 years in a chest nobody would open. Violet stood frozen and white, certain that any second now he would taste the truth of it and be sick. And Roland, reading her pale face entirely wrong, only apologized between swallows for maybe eating up some rare, costly ingredient she had been saving, and praised it all the more. The guilt was worse than the fear. He had eaten before she offered, and now he stumbled through an apology for it and swore he would buy her a whole meal to make up for a few mouthfuls of weeds. She could not stand it, so she built the fire back up, set fresh water to boil, and with her back half turned so he would not see what it came from, she dissolved 2 spoonfuls of the ugly lump into the pot. When it was ready, she drank first, on purpose, a full swallow in front of him, so that whatever might happen to him would happen to her first and worse. It was only miso. It was perfectly safe. She knew that. She did it anyway because she would sooner it be her own body than his. Then she held the bowl out to him. It's free, she said, small and careful. Nobody wanted it. Roland took it in 2 huge hands. He drank it down to the last drop, and when it was gone, he held the empty bowl back out toward her, and the voice that came out of the enormous man was almost shy, the way a boy asks for a thing and is already braced to be told no. Seconds, please. Something in Violet's chest, some old shut door, came loose off its hinge. No one asked her for more. People took what she gave and told her it fell short of what they were owed. No one in her whole life had finished a thing she made and then wanted the next bite before the last one was even swallowed. She looked at the empty bowl held out in his 2 great hands, at an S rank sitting in the dirt by her little fire and begging like a glad dog for another helping of a soup she had been too ashamed to admit she cooked. And for once, the wonder rising in her had nothing to do with her eye at all. She made him seconds. Her hands shook the whole time, and she could not have told anyone whether it was fear or the other thing entirely. Later, when a blood-sucking bat dropped out of the dark and Roland put it down without even standing all the way up, Violet reached out on pure reflex and pocketed the drop it left, then froze in horror because the drop was his. She stood, sat, stood again, a small panicked loop, and Roland laughed and waved it off. He had told her already he wanted none of the drops. Take them. In fact, he said, and tasted the newest bowl, the one cooked from that very bat's leavings, and shook his head slowly at how much flavor she had pulled out of almost nothing at all. Then he made the offer that undid her. Come with me, he said. Not as a servant, not as a girl with a junk skill, but as a party. She would carry loot up from the shallow floors on that teleport bracelet of hers, while he cleared the deep ones below. He did not choose people by their skills, he told her, plain as setting a stone down on a table. She had caught a 1,000-year herb that a whole guild of trained appraisers had walked straight past. She was a hard worker. He wanted her at his side. She tried to argue. Her skill was useless. She was nobody. She would only be in the way of an S rank. He did not move an inch. And then Violet, who had been thrown away by every person she had ever tried hard for, who took each kindness as a bill about to come due, put her face in her hands and cried. Through it, she promised she would work harder than anyone alive, that she would never once let him down, and bowed her head so low it nearly brushed the ground, because in her heart, it was not a gift she had been handed. It was a debt. Something this good had to be paid back with everything she had, or it would be taken from her, the way everything always was. Roland let her cry and said they would register the party at the guild, right after one thing he had to see to first. She did not hear the shadow in that. She was already reaching for her pot. She cooked again, a bigger meal this time, the way you feed someone you have decided to keep. He drew raw peony meat from a bag that somehow kept it fresh, and her eye named the meat good for the same dishes as pork. She foraged burdock root and cluster mushrooms, and a wide dried leaf. The black eye lit up as fit for grilling, ground mountain pepper husks against a flat stone into the miso paste, and made him a hot pot and a leaf-grilled miso that her eye named in warm words out of a country that did not exist on any map in this world. She hid the vegetables down in the broth, the way her mother used to, all those years and a whole world ago, to sneak greens past a child who would not eat them. And somewhere in the steam and the firelight, feeding a man who kept holding out his bowl for more, Violet let herself think it, just once, just a little, carefully, the way you test thin ice with the toe of one boot. Maybe the eye everyone had told her to be ashamed of was worth something after all. Roland came crashing back through the trees, and what he dropped at Violet's feet was not the armful of mountain vegetables she had asked for. It was a whole boar. He announced it the way a child announces a drawing. She had said gather mushrooms. He had heard hunt, apparently, and gone and done that instead. Her left eye was still open, still black, and over his grinning face, a little string of words floated up the way they always did now. Proud stance, smug face, captions the otherworld eye, laid over living people whether she wanted them or not. She closed the eye. She had finally learned how. They ate the meal she had already made, the pot of soup and the leaf-wrapped meat grilled in the dark brown paste the world had no name for, and her eye called miso. Roland took one mouthful and went still. Then he tore through every scrap of the cooked meat at once, like a man who had just remembered he was starving. When it was gone, he looked almost sheepish. Then he set to the fresh boar with his knife, and his hands moved so fast she lost the blade entirely. One blink, and the carcass was neat joints. The next, a chunk of meat the size of her head was being pressed into her arms. Eat more, he told her. You are too small. You will never grow. She had eaten one piece. She said so. He pressed it on her anyway. While he worked, she cooked him a second pot, and when his broad back was turned, she did the one thing she could never do in front of him. She dug the ugly lump out of the chest at her hip and stirred it in. 2 quick spoonfuls. Miso. The only seasoning on the whole continent that nobody else could even see was food. He drank it down and pronounced it the kind of thing that made a man want a drink beside it. Then he touched the stone set in his bracelet, the twin of the one on her own wrist, and called for someone named Xavier. The boy was simply there. One breath, the far side of the fire stood empty. The next, a slim, silver-haired boy filled it, close enough to touch Roland's shoulder, asking flatly whether this was work. No, Roland said. An introduction. He named Violet the new porter and named the boy the veteran, warned that he was prickly but a good sort at bottom. Xavier looked at Violet the way you look at something tracked in on a boot. Was the newcomer even useful? He wanted to know. She greeted him as politely as she knew how and told him she would do her best, and something in the phrase set him off like a struck match. He hated those words, he told her. Effort was assumed. only results counted. The dungeon was not soft enough to take trying as an excuse. She sank under it because he was right. Working hard had never once been enough for someone the world had already stamped useless. Roland put a hand on her head and told her not to mind him. Then he tipped her chin toward the firelight so the boy could see the left eye, flat and black, and called it a cool skill, one nobody alive could copy. Xavier said it looked useless to him and demanded to know how a nobody with a dead skill had wormed onto an S-Ranks crew. Roland ended it the simple way. He took the boy's head in one huge hand and laid down the law. Xavier kept the deep floors. Violet took the shallow. There would be no contest between them. Then he shoved a pot of boar stew into Xavier's hands. Xavier drank it. His eyes narrowed over the rim. He was not, the look said, going to be bought off with a hot meal. But Roland told him the real reason, plainly. This porter could name the drops the others walked straight past, the junk-looking ones, with no appraisal skill at all. Xavier demanded to know how anyone read a drop without appraisal. Violet opened her mouth and it fell out on its own. "I'll do my," she started, and clapped both hands over it a beat too late. Then Roland let the warmth drop out of his voice and asked if she had heard about the 1,000-year herb, the one that surfaced once in 1,000 years, a head of a calamity. The guild was already conscripting every porter who carried appraisal. The strongest hunters were bracing for something. He said it lightly. It did not land lightly. For a moment, the fire seemed smaller, and 300 years of quiet sat over the clearing like a held breath. Then he grinned and asked what was for the next course, and the shadow folded itself up and went back to waiting. It came out, over the embers, that the black-eyed porter everyone underrated was the first person ever recorded to have found a 1,000-year herb. The first ever. Xavier stared at her like she had insulted him by being small. He could not stand two kinds of people, he said. The ones who swore they would try and did not, and the ones who worked themselves raw and then would not stop calling it not enough. Have some confidence, he told her. Boast for once in your life. Then, gruff, he gave his name, the short form of it, and stuck out a hand, and she took it. Roland chose that moment to mention that the boy in front of her was 16. So was she, he added, though she looked about 13. Xavier went a shade of red that had nothing to do with the fire and told him to shut up. Then he caught her smallest finger and nipped it, a sharp little pinch, one bead of blood, and let go before she could pull away. "There," he said. A mark, Roland explained more gently, before the boy could frighten her with it. Xavier's skill stepped between shadows. Anywhere he could see one, he could be there in the space of a blink, and a person he had marked he could reach even where he could not see them at all. Reach out through the dark and pull them to his side, out of anywhere. She looked at the tiny red dot on her pinky and understood that she had just been tied to something that was the furthest thing in the world from useless. "Call me first." Xavier was not looking at her when he said it. "Not after you have tried and lost. The instant you think you might. That is not weakness. That is arithmetic." She kept apologizing without quite knowing what for, and only slowly understood. It was the do my best again. It kept falling out of her. It kept setting him off. By morning, Roland had made it worse without trying. He called her the sort who never seemed troubled by anything. He meant it kindly, a compliment. Xavier came off the ground like water off a hot pan. She was troubled constantly, he snapped. She just never said so. And then he was reeling them off, every time the world had helped itself to her. Left behind as bait, blamed for a thing she had not done, cheated blind by an armor shop that saw her coming. She never spoke up, not once. And he asked Roland, furious, whether he honestly could not see it. Then he rounded on Roland and ordered an S-rank hunter, down to the 100th floor of the northern dungeon, now, and to signal the moment he arrived. Roland pointed out that even for him, the 100th floor was 3 hours down. Xavier did not care. He flicked Violet once, square in the middle of the forehead. Her eye caught it and went black on reflex, and over the boy a single word bloomed and hung there, patient as a candle. It named the thing that lived under all the scolding, and it was not a soft word. Something devoted, and a size too fierce for its own good. A word you would carve over a guard dog. She decided not to look at it too hard. Then they were gone. Xavier folded down into a shadow. Roland simply ran, fast enough that the mist closed behind him like water over a stone, which left Violet alone in the cold ash, realizing with a slow drop in her stomach that she was somehow expected at the 100th floor as well, a place where even an A-rank party spent a full hour on a single floor, past the 80th, and that she had better learn everything about it, very fast. The guild hall should have been packed. Instead, it stood nearly empty, the adventurers all out in the field, the staff behind the counter moving like people bailing a sinking boat. It was the 1,000-year herb season, and it swallowed everything. Violet found a corner and did the only thing she knew to do before danger. She read everything the archive held on the Northern Dungeon's 100th floor. 3 main monster types, 3 rare ones, the strays that wandered down from above and up from below, their weaknesses, their attack patterns, the drops each one left behind. She fed it all into the same memory that had once swallowed a 50,000 entry drop encyclopedia whole. Her one worry was the drops. Without the real thing in front of her eye, she was not sure she could tell the near-identical ones apart. A porter loitering by the yard door watched her cram and made sure she heard him. Chase, one of the guild's own. He had caught her muttering "do my best" under her breath and found it funny. Worth was output, he informed the room. Effort was the word people used instead of having results. A porter with a dead skill and a nice attitude was still just a porter with a dead skill. She thanked him, which seemed to irritate him far more than an argument would have. When she reached the counter, a harried clerk waved her off before she got 2 words out. "No time. Herb season. Out you go." But an older receptionist caught her by the shoulder before she could turn. Hannah. And Hannah rounded on the clerk, appalled. This was the black-eyed boy the director himself had left standing orders to send straight up to his office. Why on earth had he been turned away? The director, wanting her. Violet's mind went helpfully to the worst thing she had done lately, which was feed an S-rank hunter a lump of stuff the whole world agreed was garbage, and she braced to be marched off and made to answer for it. Then the world stepped sideways. Xavier had caught her arm in the guild between one heartbeat and the next, and stepped them both straight down through the dark into this. A rocky floor lit like dusk, with no sun to light it, deep enough that no sane person climbed here for the fun of it. He had already knotted a rope from his own wrist to hers. "Never leave my side," he told her. Not for anything. For once, she did not argue. Roland was waiting. So was the thing in front of him. It reared up out of the dim, a slime the pale translucent green of old glass, taller than 3 men and wide as a cart. A big king slime, the kind every sane party skipped because killing it cost more than it ever paid back. Roland felled it in one stroke. It was simply over. The thing burst into a flare of deep violet light and slumped into a great heap of dropped herbs. Thousands of them, ordinary, worthless by the armful. Xavier stepped her to the pile in a blink, and Roland told them to search it for a 1,000-year herb. Then a second big king slime heaved up, and Roland put it down exactly as fast, and Violet saw it. The dying flash of the first slime had been violet, pure, whole, edge to edge, the plain color of a plain death, but this one had something living inside it. For the length of a single lightning blink, no longer, a thread of pale yellow ran through the violet like a vein of gold caught in a struck match, there and gone before the light had finished dying. Nobody else turned a hair. To the whole party, the slime had flashed and fallen, and that was all. To her black eye, the flash had a color inside its color, and the color meant something. That one. She pointed past the first heap without a shred of doubt. The new pile. That is where the 1,000-year herb is. Not this one. Xavier rounded on her. How could she possibly know? She had not touched a single herb, had not turned over one leaf. He flatly did not believe she had checked them, because she could not have, not in the space of one breath. She had not checked them, she admitted, honestly puzzled that this needed saying at all. She had seen it, in the color of the flash, the yellow inside the violet. Did they not? She stopped, because plainly they did not. Roland went very still. Then he laughed, delighted, and told her to go on then, find it, a test with his whole grin behind it. Xavier stepped her across to the second heap, and she went straight to it, no searching, and lifted the 1,000-year herb out of 2,000 ordinary ones, like plucking the one warm stone off a cold beach. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. A porter with a useless skill had just read, in the death color of a monster, a thing no appraiser in the whole guild could have caught with both hands, and an hour to do it. She watched the understanding land on the two of them, and did not know where to put her eyes. They gathered for hours after that, Roland clearing king slimes as they came, the 2 porters filling bags behind him. Xavier grumbled the whole time that it was madness to spend an S-rank hunter on herb picking. A porter's job, he said, doing a porter's job while insulting it. Violet sorted the stems with a care that bordered on rude, tossing back any that did not match. Roland asked what she was looking for. See how the vein curves? She turned a stem to catch the dim light. Just there, at the base. A true one curves, only a little. A false one runs dead straight. He watched a porter half his size teach him a thing he had never learned in all his years in the trade, and looked quietly, hugely pleased about it. She had just lifted another herb, breath caught with the small clean joy of the right one, when the air moved wrong. A giant mantis came out of the dark, and its scythe arm speared the exact patch of ground she was crouched on. It it never reached her. Xavier had her by the collar and out of the way before the blow finished falling. She felt the yank, then the wind of the strike passing where her back had just been. Roland ended the thing with one cut to the joint of its neck. It simply folded, its death light glowed, and her eye read the color and caught on it. A deep violet, deeper than any common drop glow she had ever seen. A shade the world did not hand out often, and there in the grass where the creature fell lay a long, thin thing. Roland picked it up, turned it over once, and tossed it aside. An old blade, worn thin, worth nothing. Junk. He said it with the same total confidence he had once said it about a helmet, and went back to the herbs without a second glance. Violet looked at the thin old sword lying discarded in the grass. She could not have told anyone why. She only knew what it was to be the thing the strong looked at once and threw away, and she could not leave it lying there. When no one was watching, she gathered it up, quiet, along with a scatter of potions no one had bothered to pick up, and folded them into her bag, which had room enough and to spare. Xavier caught her at it, of course. He scolded her for scavenging junk, and then, still scolding, he dropped 2 more drops into her bag with his own hand and told her, rough, that whatever happened down here, she was never to stray more than an arm from Roland. Never, he said. Not by a step, not for anything. She started to say she would do her, caught it this time, and only nodded. The rope ran from his wrist to hers. The big man walked ahead of them both, humming something with no tune, and somewhere between the mantis and the blade, without anyone saying a word to make it so, the 3 of them had quietly become a thing that would come apart if you took one piece away. She did not have a name for that yet, and her eye, for once, stayed shut and offered her none. Roland went through the king slime matron the way a man walks through a curtain. It stood the size of a cottage, and it healed as fast as he cut it, so he stopped trying to cut it apart and simply struck the same spot again and again, faster than Violet's eye could follow, until the core buried deep inside it burst, and the whole quivering mountain sank and lost its shape. He sheathed his sword before the body had finished falling. Then it flushed gold and thinned into light. Violet had read about this floor the night before, every line of it, and the reading had sat warm in her chest all the way down. The matron, its healing, the trick of hammering one place to outrun the mending. She had recited the whole of it at the door before Roland could finish his safety speech, and he had laughed and laid his broad hand flat on her head and called her a good student. Now she tugged the rope that ran from her wrist to Xavier's and pointed, because gold meant a drop, and gold out of a thing like this meant something. Don't get excited, Xavier said, letting her drag him a step. He kept his voice deliberately flat. This boss carried a name on the floor, he told her. The Dud, the one that killed easy and gave nothing back, the one 100 parties had gutted for 100 empty rooms. Maybe, Violet thought, the 101st time was when the luck finally turned. She did not say it aloud. She only watched the gold settle onto the stone and wanted, very much, to see what it had left behind. Past the boss room, the passage ended at a blank wall, and set into the stone were 4 hollows shaped like blades, each one glowing a soft gold that promised treasure and gave nothing. Roland thumped a fist against it. The finest appraisers in the kingdom had stood exactly where they were standing, he said, and not one of them had ever read a thing out of these. The gold shone. The wall stayed shut every single time. Xavier called her a drop-obsessed little oddball and flicked her forehead, and that was the moment her left eye warmed and went black on its own. Words rose over the 3 of them, the way a name rises over a thing. Over her own hands hung a word for the way she could not stop gathering what other people threw down. Over Roland hung the plain smug pride sitting on his face, and it made her want to laugh. Over Xavier hung a word for something fierce and holding on, and hers, so warm and so close that she looked away from it quickly and decided not to read it too hard. Then she saw the faint letters cut into the hollows themselves. She ran at the wall to read them, tripped on the rope, and scraped her knee on the stone, and Roland scooped her up under one arm before she had finished falling, promising her a potion later. Close enough at last, she read the letters aloud. They meant, near as her mouth could shape them, open the door. The wall ground apart. Roland whooped and lunged for the gap, and Xavier threw himself bodily into the big man's path. It could be a trap, he snapped, and he was down to 2 steps now, only 2, so nobody was charging anywhere. Roland reached to sweep him along as well, and Xavier slapped the hand away. A man could not swing a sword with both arms full of people, could he? His fingers, when he caught Violet's, had gone cold. Not going in, he said flatly, was also a choice. Roland only laughed. The gap opened onto a small room walled floor to ceiling with books. To Roland and Xavier, the spines were meaningless scratches. To Violet, they blazed. Her eye usually named one thing at a time, two at the very most. Here, every title on every shelf lit up at once. A whole room full of words out of a world this one had never known, and the sheer flood of them made her breath catch in her throat. How to brew tea, how to wear a festival robe, taro root recipes, a book that cataloged the kinds of temperament a person could carry, and inside it, when she cracked it open, the very words her eye hung over the people she loved, the prickly warmth that lived over Hannah, the fierce devotion that lived over Xavier. Xavier eased a book off the shelf with two careful fingers to test it for traps. Nothing bit. He let go of her hand and noticed, out loud, that the shapes on the spines matched the hollows the matron's wall had worn. So those hollows had been letters all along. Roland turned a few pages, saw nothing he could read, and mused that collectors paid good coin for rare nonsense. They might haul the lot out and sell it. Then Violet went cold, because 3 shelves over sat a book she did not merely decode. She knew it, a complete encyclopedia of demons. The priest's voice came back to her all at once. His old warning that when the 1,000-year herb bloomed, the way it had just bloomed by the fistful in her own pouch, Calamity came walking behind it, and the horned ones with it. She opened the book, and her eye read straight down the grim catalog of them, kind by kind, named for greed and anger and sloth and doubt, and past those the greater ones, and past even those the starved, the hungry dead, the ones who died still wanting. Xavier plucked the book out of her hands, saying she couldn't read a mark of it anyhow. Roland told her to keep whichever one she liked, and tucked the demon book into her pack himself, since even the pictures might teach her something. On another shelf, a book of 100 famous blades lay open, and there, listed plainly among legends, was the thin old sword Roland had thrown away that very morning as 10 silver junk. She looked at it a long moment and said nothing. Nobody in the whole world could read this room but her. The thought did not land like a gift. It landed like a cold hand closing quietly around the back of her neck, and for the first time, the priest's story stopped being a story. They stepped back out into the passage. The wall ground shut behind them, and the room was simply gone. The books went with it. The demon book in her pack, the ones stacked in Roland's arms, all of them thinned to nothing between one breath and the next, the way drops did when you tried to carry them out of the dungeon. Whatever she had seen in there, she could not take. She could only keep what she had already put to memory. Roland shrugged and called it an interesting little detour. Xavier called it a waste of time. He did not mean anything by it. Violet knew that, the way she knew that most cruelties came free and thoughtless. But the word landed in an old, worn place, and quietly, without letting her face show a thing, she folded up the same conclusion she had folded 1,000 times before, that her eye, the one thing in the world that was only hers, was worthless after all. The words over Roland's face had already blinked out. The eye had gone dark on its own, the way it did, and offered her nothing to argue with. They pressed the stones set into their bracelets, and the dungeon let go of all 3 of them at once. Out in the open air, Roland had asked for the grilled miso again, and then, kindly and on purpose, hauled a complaining Xavier off to hunt, leaving Violet the fire and the quiet to steady herself in. She swept the bank with her black eye out of pure habit, and the eye that was worthless found something in the grass, a knob of pungent wild horseradish no forager here would have looked at twice. So much for worthless. She set water to boil and started the miso, and tried not to think too hard about the word waste. Then she remembered the day's drops and tipped out her bag, and 3 small treasure chests came tumbling loose among the odds and ends. The first gave a ring that would harden a body against some 30 blows worth of harm. The second gave a necklace that fed a mage's magic, worth 30 silver at the very least. Violet looked at the pair of them, sighed, and set them aside, because she had wanted food and been handed jewelry, and she muttered at her junk chests for it. Even her good luck came out useless in her hands. The third chest held an ugly brown block, and her eye read it plain, a curry spice, middling hot, the kind that turned a pot of plain river water into something worth crossing a room for. No appraiser alive could have named the filthy-looking lump. She could. 1 spoonful, and her eye read a thin curry off the pot. 2 spoonfuls, and it read a curry soup. a fuller measure, worked into a cup, and it read a proper curry, the sort meant for rice or for warm flat naan. She chose the middle heat on purpose. Too sweet and Roland would grumble, too fierce and someone would suffer. And only when the smell had begun to rise did she realize, with a small cold jolt, that she had never once tasted curry in her whole life and had no earthly way to know whether her eye had read it true. Roland and Xavier came back with a deer slung over Roland's shoulder just as the spice caught the air. Roland stopped dead and asked, half accusing, whether she had skimmed coin somewhere to buy a spice that deer. Only a drop, she told him, and hoped it suited them, and privately begged the thing to suit them. Xavier frowned at the yellow-brown pot, said flatly that she didn't earn anywhere near enough for spice like that, and then, still grumbling, dug bread out of his storage bag, bread that came out as fresh as the morning it went in. Then they ate. Roland went at the curry soup straight from the pot and made a sound she had never once heard him make over food, and called it dangerously good, the kind of thing a man could ruin himself on. Xavier tore off a piece of bread, dragged it through the thicker curry, put it in his mouth, and stopped. He looked at the pot as though it had personally insulted him. How, he wanted to know, did a taste like that come off a drop? And why in the world was something this good not on every market in the kingdom? Because nobody could name it, Violet said. The wonders were simply too hard to read, so the whole bright world walked straight past them and threw them out. Roland set the pot down. That, he said, was exactly why she was registering as a porter at the guild. She started to say her cooking was nothing worth charging for. Xavier cut her off and told her plainly that the two of them had already climbed all the way to the 100th floor and taken the title for it, so that whatever she was worth would be written down somewhere the world could not argue with. They had gone and earned her proof before she had even agreed to be proven. Violet looked into the fire and for the first time let herself decide to walk back onto the floor that had thrown her out. A line of 40 or 50 waited at the guild doors, some of them an hour deep in the wait already. Violet trailed after Roland and Xavier toward the entrance, and a big adventurer caught her by the shoulder and told her to get in line like everyone else. She apologized at once and turned to go find the back of it. She always went to the back, and Xavier's hand closed on her arm before she had taken a single step. Why, he wanted to know, was she the only one who kept wandering off? Roland only shrugged. If there was a line, then they would stand in the line. Violet thanked the man for correcting her and meant it. The man's face changed. So did the faces near him. They had been looking at a small nobody of a porter, and now they were looking at that same small nobody, standing easy at the shoulder of an S-rank hunter every soul on the floor could name, and the color drained straight out of them. Down the line, the whispering started and spread and doubled back. Who was the boy Cole that he strolled in with Lord Roland and the silver-haired porter both at his side? An old porter near the front of the line had been squinting at her for a while, the way you squint at a face you half remember. Then he found it, and he said it out loud to the whole room. "That face," he said, "that's the porter the Grey Road lot left for dead and branded a thief, the one the guild scratched off the rolls on their word alone." The floor went quiet in a spreading ring, and then the floor remembered. Violet stood dead still in the middle of it, while the memory moved mouth to mouth around her, and every mouth carried a piece of the story the Grey Road party had spread, that their porter had been dead weight, a hand in the coin purse, a thief who got only what thieves get. She had heard that story used to bury her once. Now she heard it laid down beside the plain fact standing in front of them all. That same thrown-away porter, walked in by an S-rank hunter, and the guild would show them inside the hour, about to be begged for by the guild itself. The story did not survive the daylight. She could watch it not surviving. Faces that had passed the Grey Road tail along like a warm coin now would not meet her eye. One man muttered, low, that they had repeated it like fools. A woman said the Grey Road name the way you say the name of something gone rotten in the back of a cupboard. The lie she had worn like a brand for months came apart in the open air, in front of 100 strangers, and the shame of it slid, at long last, off her and onto the ones who had built it. She could feel the whole room deciding it. She could feel the weight change hands, and nothing happened. No one was called up to answer for any of it. The guild spoke no apology, offered no reinstatement, unmade nothing it had done to her. The Grey Road party was not there to go pale, or to be made small, or to pay so much as a copper. They were somewhere else entirely, whole and comfortable and unbothered. And the debt only stood up in the middle of the floor with its name finally spoken aloud, and went right on standing there unpaid. The crowd turned. The ones who had wronged her never felt the wind of it. Violet did not forgive anyone. She was not asked to. She only stood there while the oldest wound in her body was pried open in public and left open, and understood with a strange dry calm that being believed at last was not the same thing as being made whole. Roland did not let the moment sit and cool. He turned Violet by the shoulder to face the room and tipped her chin up so the whole floor could see the flat black eye the world had spent her whole life calling a curse. "Remember this face," he told them. Not cruel, just loud and certain, the way he said everything. Xavier stood at her other shoulder and told the room the same thing, harder. They were to look at the black-eyed porter and remember well, because anyone who ever troubled her again would answer for it to him. Then Roland told them what she was. This was his porter, he said. She read worth in the things the finest appraisers in the kingdom threw into the gutter, and she cooked food a grown man would embarrass himself over, and she belonged with them. And he was putting her on his own party's roll right here, in front of every one of them, so there could be no mistake ever again about who she was and exactly what she was worth. The same crowd that had jeered at a useless porter stared at her now in plain, open awe. Here and there in the press, someone who had once passed the useless porter joke along scrambled to be heard saying they had always known there was something to the black-eyed boy. They had said as much, hadn't they? Right from the start. Nobody near them was fooled, but the room turned all the same. The exact people who had laughed now shoving to stand on the right side of her, and Violet came apart. She had spent her whole life certain she was worth nothing. She had been taught it, made to recite it aloud on her knees, folded it into herself so many times that it had long since stopped even hurting. She had nowhere to put this. A room full of people were being told out loud that she mattered, and the huge man saying it believed every single word, and there was nothing anywhere in her built to hold a thing that size. Somewhere under all of it, her mother's voice surfaced, the old line she had been given as a small child, and never once believed, that everyone alive is needed, whatever skill they carry, and that a person ought to value herself for the sake of the ones who love her. She had always thrown the first half of it away. Standing here, she still could not quite pick it back up. But for the first time, it was not only her mother saying those words into an empty room. 100 strangers were saying them too. Her face crumpled. The tears came up hot and fast, and she could not stop them and did not try, standing small between the two of them, while the whole floor watched the discarded porter be claimed out loud by an S rank. Xavier looked away, the tips of his ears going red, and for once did not tell her to stop. Roland set his heavy hand on her head, the way he had in the boss room, and left it there, and let her cry. Before the room could settle into whatever it was becoming, Hannah came shoving through the middle of it. She was worn ragged, half in tears herself, and she caught Violet's arm in both hands like a woman grabbing at a rope thrown into a river. There she was. Finally, there she was. Why was she forever turning her back on the guild? And why did Xavier keep carrying her off? She threw a glare at Xavier fierce enough to peel paint, and she did not let go. Then she begged. "Please," she said. "Please." She needed Violet, needed her badly, and there was no time to explain it gently. Behind the two of them, the floor was still churning, the Grey Road name still going sour in 100 mouths, the old debt still standing there named and unpaid in the middle of the room. But Hannah was already pulling her toward the counter, and whatever waited past it, and Violet, wet-faced, claimed, wanted from 3 directions at once, let herself be pulled. She did not yet have a word for what the guild wanted from her. She only knew, the way you know weather, that the quiet was over. Hannah reached up and pinned a small guild tag to Violet's collar before anyone could stop her, and towed her toward the front of the line. Roland's hand came down and peeled the tag off in one motion. Not a chance. "Cole's my porter. That's the only name I came here to register." He was not, he added, about to hand the boy over to the guild. The two of them squared off across the counter. Hannah planted both hands on the stone and named the emergency call-up, the guild's own right in a crisis to claim any hand it needed, and along the wall, the floor began to buzz. Half of them were already asking it under their breath. What was one small porter worth? That an S-rank hunter and the guild would fight over him in the open? Violet stood between the two of them and wished the floor would swallow her. Her eye. They were about to drag her useless eye out where the whole hall could see it. Xavier stepped in before it could go further. Whatever the guild meant to ask of Cole, he wanted to know, was it worth more than the boy staying with them? Hannah didn't give ground. I have to gather every 1,000-year herb I can before the Calamity comes, she said. I need eyes that can tell a true stem from a false one. Xavier turned to Violet. Empty your bag. She didn't understand, but she obeyed. She always obeyed. She loosed the mouth of her storage bag and tipped it out, and kept tipping. Herbs poured across the floor in a green flood and would not stop. They mounded. They climbed. When the last of it settled, the pile stood as tall as the guild hall around it, 2 full stories of cut green, and the whole room drew one breath at once. Then the scoffing started. A haul that size. Someone laughed. 4 out of every 5 stems had to be fakes. No porter alive gathered that much true herb. None of it's fake. Violet made herself smile, for Hannah's sake, and said it quiet and certain. Every last stem is real. Roland patted her head like she had done a clever trick. King Slime drops. Hannah burst into tears. Glad, she wept. So glad there was this much, and already drowning in the thought of the hours it would take to comb the rare herb out of a mountain the size of a building. That was when Xavier reached into his pouch. He drew out a single 1,000-year herb and set it before the guild appraiser, asking him to confirm it while his skill still held for the day. The man murmured the words that woke his appraisal and named it on the spot. Genuine, a true find. Xavier laid down a second, confirmed again. Then, mild as weather, he asked how many 1,000-year herbs the guild had taken in since word first spread that they could be found. 3, Hannah answered. Xavier set down a third. That makes us even. And then he drew 40 or 50 stems out of his bag in one smooth pull and spread them across the counter, and the hall went dead silent. The appraiser's hands shook as he worked through 20 more, one at a time, and every single stem came back the same. A true one, a true one, a true one. Hannah pressed both hands to her mouth and half laughed, half begged. Was there some monster down there now that dropped nothing but the rarest herb in the world? Xavier didn't answer her. He pointed instead to a second pile, set apart from the first. Common herbs, worthless ones, combed out clean and stacked on their own, and that pile too stood 2 stories high. No appraiser had sorted that. No skill in the hall was fast enough to. Someone had read every stem by sight, true from false, quicker than any skill could be spent. And there was exactly one person in that room who could. Hannah turned. She looked straight at Cole. Roland didn't give Hannah the chance to say what her eyes had already worked out. A porter who could do that, he told her, belonged in his party and nowhere else. He set his guild card on the counter and named the 3 of them to enter on the roll. Himself, Xavier as porter, and Cole added on. And something in Violet came apart. It wasn't the crowd this time, and it wasn't the old wound torn open. It was the small flat card on the stone, the plainest thing in the world, her name going onto it beside theirs. Her eyes filled and spilled before she could think to stop them. Roland panicked. He always panicked at tears. He blurted that she could take a third of every haul from now on. No, more than that, and started fumbling the numbers higher, trying to buy the crying to a stop. Adventurers don't cut their own share to dry someone's eyes. Xavier's voice sliced clean through the fumbling. He said it straight himself. Roland took half, and the rest split even between the 2 porters, a quarter each, and that was the end of it. Then he caught Violet's wet face in one hand and made her look at him. What did you mean? Impossible. She couldn't answer. So Roland answered for her. Xavier was blunt with everyone, he said, and it had never once been dislike. Back in the dungeon, before the teleport pulled them free, Xavier had been the one to rope her hand to Cole's so the skill would carry them out together. As one group, no one left behind on the wrong side of anything. She doesn't do that, Roland said, for people she doesn't care about. Violet looked at Xavier, and Xavier looked away, the tips of his ears going red. Through the tears, she managed the truest thing she had. I like you, both of you, so much. Her left eye warmed then, all on its own, and went black. A word settled in the air beside Xavier, patient as a candle, in the shape of a name from the world only her eye could read. Something about a spirit that did the opposite of whatever it was asked. Violet blinked at it. Xavier had no horns. Xavier looked as human as anyone in the hall, so she let the word go, the way she let so many of them go, unread, and it faded, and she thought no more of it. Hurry up and make it official, Xavier told her, rough again. She started to protest, that she was a burden, that she was weak, that she needed looking after and did not deserve people this strong. And Xavier flicked her forehead. One flick, harder than anything she had felt in her life. A bright bar of pain straight between the eyes, and the tears stopped cold. She stood there groaning with both hands clapped to her head. The whole spiral snapped in 2. Roland leaned in, mournful as a graveside. He might simply die, he confided, if he never got to eat her cooking again. So she had best sign. and be quick about it. She signed. She didn't even read it. A man might die. She signed. Xavier put a hand over his face and asked how? Not one word of that had struck her as strange. Never sign a thing again without me standing right there. This time it was only Roland, he told her. The next person to hand her a contract would rob her blind. Violet only smiled and said no one would ever bother tricking someone like her. In her whole life, a liar had been rarer than a dragon. Hannah, listening, looked faintly ashamed of her own worldliness beside that. Then she remembered she had business, and the business was bad. The guild could not buy a single drop item for the next 3 months, she warned. Their one appraiser was buried to the neck in the 1,000-year herb, and would be for a season. And that trust of yours, she added, gentle and worried, is going to get you eaten alive one day. They handed her the whole storage bag anyway. Keep what she liked, Roland told her. Sell what she liked. He only ever wanted the rare, delicious drops, and every scrap of the rest was hers. Violet could not stand the thought of wasting a single coin's worth of it, but the guild would not buy for 3 whole months, and she had no idea where else a person even began. So she carried the bag out past the town wall to a quiet hollow at the forest's edge, where no eyes could count what was hers, and tipped it onto the grass to see what she was working with. Healing salves, a hair growth tonic, a strong potion, a small trinket, a thin thread of her memory placed as worth a little guard to whoever wore it, and at the bottom, the thin sword. She turned it over in both hands. Roland had thrown this one aside that morning without a second glance. Too thin, he'd called it. No good in a fight. Not worth the weight of carrying. She kept it anyway. She always kept the things the world was quick to call useless. She knew, better than most, how often the naming was wrong. The ugly lumps she set apart in a pile of their own, the dull, filthy-looking blocks no appraiser alive could name, and every adventurer threw away, the ones her black eye read as miso, as curry, as food from a world this one had long forgotten. Those she would never sell. Those were hers to cook. She turned the miso block over and frowned. It was nearly gone. She would have to find more, somehow, and soon. Everything else she would sell in town, and she knew exactly where to start. There was an armor shop up the main row, the one where a kind clerk had once sold her the light little cooking pot she still wore on her head, and a kind face was as good a door as any to knock on. She came in with the pot tugged down over her head like a helmet, and walked straight into a scolding already in progress. 2 of the senior clerks had the kind one backed against the counter, making him do his cleaning over, and their voices carried. They were furious with him. He had very nearly angered a high-rank customer, they hissed, Roland himself. And a shop like theirs could be ruined by a single S-rank's sour word. Violet shrank at the threshold. It was a fine shop, all racked steel and polished cases, built for adventurers a great deal grander than a luggage boy, and she felt every inch of how little she belonged in it. Then the clerk saw her, and everything turned over at once. They knew the face, the black-eyed one, the small porter who ran with Roland's party now, and they nearly fell over one another bowing her in, all honey and honorifics, where a breath before there had been only contempt for the boy at the door. Violet blinked at the fuss and wondered if the rumor was just about her joining the party. Surely it could not be anything grander than that. She didn't want their honey. She wanted one of them. "Is the clerk with the broom here?" she asked the floor, small and clear. "I'd like Nate, please." Nate's head came up, startled. One of the others demanded to know why him, of all people, after he'd once been short with her. "He was kind to me." Violet tapped the pot on her head. "He sold me this. It's the most useful thing I own." And then the clerks began to squabble over her, over who would win the honor of serving the customer the rumors had suddenly made worth chasing. And Violet, who could not read a squabble as anything but rejection, got it exactly wrong. None of them wanted to be stuck waiting on a poor porter. Of course they didn't. Her eyes stung, and she turned to leave. Nate stepped in front of her. He went down in a bow so deep, his brow nearly brushed the floorboards. "I'll serve you. Let them argue all they like." When he straightened, there were tears standing at the corners of his eyes. He asked what she was looking for, and then he thanked her for forgiving someone like him, which confused her badly, because she could not for the life of her recall him ever needing to be forgiven. She laid her drops out on the counter to sell. That was when the owner leaned in at Nate's shoulder, gone gray and jittery, and started whispering fast. Roland's porter, in their shop. "Pay the boy well," he urged. "Pay him over, whatever it cost. Keep him sweet, and keep the S rank off their necks." Overpay and smile the whole time. Nate named a price. It was an honest one, a fair one, and Violet, who had taught herself the worth of more drops than she could count in the dark, saw at a glance that it sat a good deal higher than the goods were worth, so she pushed it back down. Just the fair price. She slid the extra coin across the counter to him. Not a copper more. I won't be paid over for a name or for a fear that's got nothing to do with me when the honest number's right there and we both know it. Something in Nate's face broke open. He bowed again, lower. I'll deal with you true. Every time. And more than that, he swore. He would walk her to the honest shops himself, the ones that would never cheat her, so that a soul who traded as fair as she did would never once be robbed for it. Violet left with fair coin in her pocket and a door held open where a wall had stood. Behind her, the town hummed the same word it had hummed all week. The guild frozen for a season. Every appraiser in the region bent double over one impossible herb. Every party that could hold a blade sent scrambling to gather more of it before the thing that herb foretold arrived. She still had no name for what was coming. She only knew, the way you know weather, that the quiet she'd just been handed was already running out. The guild had frozen every buyout for 3 whole months, so Violet took her dungeon oddments to a shop instead, meaning only to sell. Nate met her at a side counter with its own door, ran his counting skill over the whole lot, and named a price so high it frightened her worse than a cheat would have. She had braced for 80 silver. He offered 100, then climbed to 120 while she was still trying to talk him down. That's too much, she said, pushing the coins back across the wood. Ask for less, please. Nate only looked stricken, as if being told he was too generous were a kind of failing, and offered to try harder instead of less. A senior clerk hovered at his shoulder, whispering, and Violet caught the shape of it plain enough. Overpay the boy. Keep him sweet, whatever he asks for. She could not fathom why grown men flinched at a porter. It stung worse than scorn did, so she talked the number down herself to 110, 100 for the goods and 10 for the trouble, and made him take it. Then a third man cut in, cold, telling her the freeze did not entitle her to bleed the shop dry, and inviting her to take her business elsewhere. Violet looked up to answer and stopped. One of his eyes was dark and clouded over, filmed like still water, and it moved across the room the way her own hidden eye did, reading things, not merely seeing them. She gasped before she could swallow it. The man flinched. For one breath, he truly looked at her face, and something in him went white and wary, the way you go when you find a thing you had been praying not to find. Then he turned and was gone into the back too fast, and did not come out again. Nate laughed it off. Violet did not. She had spent her whole life learning that being seen was dangerous, and she had just been seen by an eye a little too much like her own. Nate walked her across the street to the magic tool shop. His own chain, he explained. The weapon shop, the general store, and this one all belonged together, run from somewhere above by a single capable hand no one at the counter ever saw. The keeper there played dumb to test her. He laid 10 items out and asked her, all innocence, what she made of them. She named them one by one. A ring that lifted water magic 3 or 4 points and dulled fire in trade. A plain sword that would take a rap of flame. On down the row, each true name landing soft and certain, until the man stopped pretending and admitted he would have hated to misjudge her. It had been a test, and she had passed it clean. Then he tried to hire her on the spot. Quit portering, work his counter. Nate panicked and refused for her before she could get her mouth open, muttering that rough customers were no place for someone like Cole. The price he offered for her lot came to double what she had braced for. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She asked him, careful, whether he was overreaching, because she did not want to cost him his living, and he explained the thing she had never once understood. Guild prices ran low because they bundled promises, he said. No cheating. A floor beneath you, whatever the market did. A sale, even with no one to vouch for you. A shop could pay far more to a seller it trusted, one who knew true worth by sight. Selling, in the end, was trust. The sting came quiet under it. The trust was not hers. It rode on 2 S-rank names now fixed to her, Roland and Xavier, and the shop was really paying those. She flushed to the roots of her hair and swore, low, that she would work until the trust was her own. The keeper watched her a moment too long. She did not see what moved behind his face. She did not hear him draw Nate aside and murmur about the boy's uncanny read, about a skill no guild could put a name to, about an old false theft that had once broken a porter called Cole. She did not see the ordinary shopkeeper warmth cool by a single degree. and a colder purpose sat under it. But the narrator did. This one mattered, the keeper judged, to hands that reached far above his little counter. He would send word up the chain that ran over all these shops, up past anywhere Violet could see. A useful morsel, he thought, for a certain idle heir to finally hear about. And beneath even that thought, far off at the edge of the province, in a dungeon left unguarded for generations, something vast had already begun to turn over in its long sleep. The man felt it the way you feel a door swing open in another room, and it made him hurry. He went to send his report. Violet counted her coins and thought only that she had done one honest day. The news broke before she reached the door. It came the way bad news always comes, all at once and out of every mouth. The neglected dungeon at the province's edge had not merely stirred, it had erupted. Monsters were pouring out of it in numbers no living person had ever seen, and a fast rider had already carried something worse behind it. The tide was turning toward the royal capital, and the crown was calling up its hunters. The cozy hum drained out of the shop in a breath. A scholar's verdict that had been traded low in a back room all afternoon and suddenly made sense to everyone at once. The strange bloom pulled from the deep was the 1,000-year herb, the once a millennium omen, and the last time it had flowered, the world had come to the edge of ending. Violet stood very still in the middle of the current. She was the one whose eye had first named that flower. She had carried it up out of the dark and called it luck. This was not a shop feud. It was not an old party's cruelty, or a wronged porter's small unpaid score. It was bigger than every wound the year had handed her, bigger than anything she had a name for, and it was moving, and it was pointed straight at a city full of people. Under her boots, the ordinary evening had cracked clean down the middle, and threaded through the fear came a stranger. Colder thought she could not shake loose, that none of this was an accident, that something, somewhere, had aimed it. She should have been afraid. Instead, for one evening, she let herself be glad. The last of her loot had sold high on Nate's word, and Violet did the sum that mattered most first, half of it, folded and set aside, to send home to her family. They were the whole reason she had endured any of it, and now, for once, she could keep them fed without going hungry to do it. The rest she spent small, a little miso, a little curry. The ugly nameless lumps only her eye could read as food, so she could cook the party something worth eating. Then she did a thing she had never once done in this city. She paid for a private room, hot water, and a wash tub, her first real wash since she had come to this place. The innkeeper only nodded, unsurprised she had earned well, and let her have it, warm and clean, and quietly happy. She reminded herself not to grow used to any of it, which was the moment Xavier let himself in to go over the next day's plan, and understood in a single startled instant, through the steam and the damp clothes, that the porter he had always called Cole was a girl. He went straight over backward off his chair. He hit the floor red to the ears and stayed down, barking at her to keep back, stay away, his voice climbing into a register she had never once heard out of him. Violet hurried over, baffled, certain the chair had given out under him, asking was he hurt, reaching to help him up. If you're a girl, he got out, not looking at her. Then say you're a girl. She stopped where she stood. I'm sorry. The apology came fast, the way it always did. I never meant to trick anyone. A girl on the roads alone gets treated like something to be taken. Cole was safer. He did not shout at that. That was the strange part. He sat on the floor with his back to her and his ears burning and said nothing at all for a long moment. And she braced, the way she always braced, for the part where the kindness turned around and threw her out. It never came. Before either of them could find the next word, a bell began to toll across the town. The deep, slow, wrong sound of a general muster, and a runner's shout carried up from the street below. The eruption had grown. Every hunter was called. March for the royal capital. The warm evening was over. It had lasted about an hour. The march carried them all the way to the capital, and for the first time in her life, the party could afford a room with a door instead of a crowded dormitory floor. It undid the last of her disguise anyway. She came out from washing, damp, and apologizing on reflex. Sure, Xavier was annoyed she would catch a chill, and found him sitting on the floor with his back to her, ears still red, as though he had not quite recovered since the inn 2 towns back. He reached up without looking and caught her cheek, and said the thing again, quieter. If she was a girl, she should have just said she was a girl. Then, lower, close, a question she was in no way equipped to answer. Did she have any idea, he asked, what it meant that he had told her he did not dislike her? Violet thought about it, seriously, and decided he must be worried she would take cold in a rough district, or dirty the borrowed guild bag. She promised she would be more careful with both. He looked at her for a second like a man watching a lamp refuse to catch, then let it go, ears blazing, and asked instead, very softly, what her name was, her real one. She almost didn't say it. The name had been Cole so long it felt like it belonged to somebody else now. Violet, she said. My mother called me Violet. She said it was a little blue flower. He tested the word once, rough, as if it did not fit his mouth. Then he kept it. From that night on, the few who stood closest to her knew her by the name her mother gave her, even while the whole rest of the world went right on calling her the boy. The capital's great market was the largest thing Violet had ever walked through, and it was frightened. Vendors traded the same rumor at every stall. The 1,000-year herb had bloomed early in the ravine north of the walls, a full season before its time, and a season turning wrong had a smell to it that everyone could catch. She crossed paths with a giant. He was the largest man she had ever seen, a quiet super-rank that folk spoke of in low voices, and he was doing nothing more fearsome than crouching to talk with a knot of children at the market's ragged edge. Children, she understood after a moment, born with the skills the world called useless, the very word that had been hung around her own neck her whole life. He sheltered them. He fed them. He had built a small roof over exactly the sort of person everyone else learned to throw away. He looked at Violet a while, at her flat black eye and her bowed shoulders, and seemed to know her without needing to ask. When she said, without quite meaning to, that she only wanted to be useful now the danger was real, that she would far rather help than be kept somewhere safe, the giant answered slow, in small plain words. Being useful and being kept safe aren't the same thing, Gideon said, unhurried. And worry that builds a cage around a person, that isn't love, whatever name it puts on itself. He said it gently, but he said it looking past her, toward where a silver-haired porter stood scowling at the crowd with his hand never far from her shadow. Violet did not follow the look. She was thinking about the cold encyclopedia she carried alone in her head, all the things this world had forgotten, and about a name in it, the giant spoke aloud without any idea what he stirred. A wolf out of the deep myth, thought extinct for an age that was said to remember still the taste of another world. The word settled in her chest, patient as a candle. She did not understand it yet, but the other thing she understood all the way down. When the Calamity reached this city, and it would, she was not going to let anyone lock her away somewhere safe. Being needed was the one thing she had never learned how to refuse. That night, the capital felt wrong in a way the market's rumors had only circled. The 1,000-year herb had opened a full season early in the northern ravine, the omen ringing out ahead of its own disaster. And above the lower city stood the northern dungeon, sealed and abandoned generations ago, its gate long unguarded because the guild had decided it was dead ground and stopped warding it. It was not dead. Sometime after dark, a thread of cold, rotten air breathed out through the sealed gate and sank down into the streets, and the people who felt it go by went quiet. Then the first tremor rolled under the floor of the world. It was small. It was enough. Violet felt it come up through her boots, and she knew, the way you know weather, that the thing the flower had promised was no longer coming. It was here, under the city, breathing, and somewhere high above the counters and the criers, a hand she still could not see had set every piece of this in motion and let it run, and had not shown its face, and would not yet. She stood in the cold breath from the gate, a girl the world had thrown away, carrying the one eye that could read what was waking under it. And for the first time in her life, she did not wait to be told she was needed. She started walking toward it. The morning after the tremor, Violet arrived in Roland's room without ever touching the door. Xavier had taken her hand in the inn hallway, and the world folded once, cold and fast. And then her boots were on Roland's rug, while the big man did squats in the middle of the floor. He had a strip of dried meat in one hand and a towel around his neck, and he was somehow eating, drying off, and working his legs all at the same time. Xavier told him, flatly, that no one needed to do 3 things at once. Roland only grinned and said something about how a man who spent a whole breath on a single task was a man who would never make S rank, and went right on with all 3. Violet watched the sheer discipline of it and, without meaning to, looked impressed. Xavier caught that look and scowled, muttering that she was allowed to be impressed by exactly one person in this room, and it was not the one doing squats. Then Xavier said the thing he had come to say. They were done with inns. The party needed a real base, walls of their own, a place with a door between the world and them. Roland lit up like a lamp. the porter who had spent her whole life insisting on living alone, he said, wanting to live together at last. That was the best news he had heard all week. There was a knock, and the largest man Violet had ever seen ducked under the frame to come in. Gideon had business with Roland, but his gentle eyes found the small boy in the corner first, the way they had in the market, and held there a moment too long. He did not repeat the whole of what he had told her the day before. He only glanced from her bowed shoulders to the silver-haired porter beside her, whose hand was already hovering near her shadow, and said, unhurried, that a lock built out of fear was still a cage, whatever softer name a man wanted to give it. Xavier pretended not to hear him, but the day's small comedy had a cold floor under it. The guild hall below was in an uproar, and the word climbing the stairs was all the same word. The northern gate had widened overnight. The sealed dungeon nobody had warded in generations was leaking. Thin, wrong monsters at the edge of the lower districts, and a cold seeping up with them that no healer could warm. Roland went still. His voice dropped out of its usual roar. A leak from a dead dungeon, he said. In the season the 1,000-year herb had bloomed. That was not a hunt. That was the front edge of a calamity. Xavier answered the fear the only way he knew. He started listing his demands for the base, fast and clipped, as if the counting could hold the cold off. Many rooms, thick doors, a locked kitchen, a lock on every last one. A key meant nothing to a man who could step through walls, and he knew it. He wanted the doors anyway. He wanted Violet behind all of them. They took the base that same evening. A narrow fortified house claimed one street ahead of a dozen country hunters driven inside the walls. Xavier arranged it exactly as he had said. A room for each of them, Violet set deepest, behind the innermost door. When Roland joked that they could all just sleep in one big room like a proper family, Xavier stepped Violet 3 paces sideways in a blink, and, red to the ears, built a wall of pillows straight down the middle of the bed, announcing that he would be the one to guard her, and that Roland could guard the hallway. It was in that first bare-walled quiet that Violet worked up the nerve to ask. She wanted to learn the sword. Not to be a hero, she said quickly, before anyone could laugh, only so that if Xavier's skill ever failed, or Roland's legs ever broke, she could stand between the two of them and whatever came. She had spent her whole life being the one carried. She did not want to only be carried anymore. Xavier refused before she finished. He pinched her nose and told her, sharp, that protecting her was his job and staying behind him was hers, and that the idea of her lifting a blade was foolish. Roland set down his meat. He took both their heads in his enormous hands and turned them gently to face him, and he reminded Xavier of a day none of them would ever unremember. The day Violet had been left ringed by monsters with a wall of fire at her back and not one soul beside her. Skills can be sealed, he told him, low. Legs can break. The one weapon nobody can ever take out of your hand, Roland said, is the choice to stand between the danger and the person next to you. That, he finished, was worth more than any rank he carried. Violet took the old thin blade from her bag, the junk sword Roland had once thrown aside as worthless, the one her black eye had quietly named a legend, and copied the stance she had watched a swordsman hold. She was clumsy. Her right hand still gripped weaker than her left, but she set her feet and did not put it down. She looked at the two of them over the wavering point and said the thing she had never once been brave enough to say out loud. I want to protect you both, not just be the one you carry. Roland's whole face went soft with pride, and he promised he would teach her properly. Xavier sighed the sigh of a man losing an argument he could not win. Fine, he grumbled. If she was going to be impossible about it, he would train at her side, though he still thought she was impossible. Then his voice dropped, and the teasing left it. He knew, he said, where she used to sleep. Worse than a storeroom, worse than any warehouse. Some nights with no roof at all, used by everyone and kept by no one. He said it looking straight at her, and he swore, quiet and fierce, that she would never live like that again, that he would not add a single new face to this party that might treat her as a thing to be spent, and that anyone who tried to use her would answer to him first. Violet, who had no idea what to do with being wanted that hard, found she had no words at all. She slept the last quiet hours of that night, and while she slept, the seal on the northern dungeon failed all the way. The gate no one had warded in generations broke open in the dark. Monsters spilled first, and the alarm bells threw the whole capital out of its bed. Violet woke to Xavier already at her door, listening to the runners on the street below. The beasts, the runners said, were dying like beasts. Roland and Gideon and every S rank the guild could raise had formed a line at the mouth of the lower districts, and every monster that reached them fell. But behind the beasts came the other thing, the tide the old omens had named. The starved, the hungry dead, drifting up through the broken gate, and where they passed a killing cold settled that no lantern pushed back and no healer could warm. Roland's blade went through them like fog. Gideon's strength found nothing to hold, nothing they had touched the dead at all. Xavier locked the base down room by room and forbade her the lower city outright. Beasts he could steal her away from in a blink, he told her, low and afraid. That cold he could not. So she would stay behind his locks, and that was the end of it. Violet went to the high window instead of arguing. Below her, the lower districts were going dark one street at a time, the lamps guttering out in a slow tide toward the north. And as she watched, her left eye warmed and went black on its own, without a drop or a chest in front of it, straining down toward the cold as though it had caught the edge of something it already knew the name of. It never did that. It only ever named things no one else could see. She pressed her hand to the glass and did not say aloud the thought forming under her ribs, that the thing sweeping the lights out down there was, somehow, hers to answer. By daylight, the guild board carried a bounty no hunter would touch. A great gray wolf had been prowling the ruined outer district since the surge, a beast straight out of old myth, one the last team to go near had simply fled from. Xavier wanted the base as far from that quarter as the walls allowed, but Violet remembered the faint floral sweetness she had been catching on the wind for 2 nights, and she asked very quietly to go and see the wolf herself. They found Fenrir among the collapsed stalls. It was enormous, and it was starving, its gray hide drawn tight over its ribs, its hackles up, keeping its distance from a city that had no food left to give even a legend. Roland's hand went to his sword on pure instinct. Violet stopped him with 2 fingers on his forearm. Her black eye read the beast, and what it read was not a monster. It was something old past counting, and wary, and hungry. Hungry the exact way she had once been hungry, the kind that makes a creature flinch from every open hand. So she did not raise a hand. She reached into her bag and took out a wrapped bundle of warm millet dumplings, cooked from a drop the whole bright world would have thrown in the gutter, and she set the plate down at the edge of the rubble. Then she sat, small and unarmed, in the cold, and waited. Xavier stood a half step behind her the entire time, poised to pull her clean out of the world the instant those jaws so much as twitched wrong. The legend circled, low, slow, testing the air. And then the wolf out of myth, the thing no S rank in the capital had dared approach, lowered its great head to a plate of dumplings and ate from the hand of a girl the world had called useless. When the plate was clean, it looked at her for a long, long moment, and it lay down near her boots and was, simply, no longer a threat. Roland let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the rubble. Of every S-rank hunter in the capital, he said, half laughing, it took the little drop item child to make peace with a legend, and not with a blade, with a plate of food. Violet rested her hand on the wolf's gaunt shoulder and understood it completely, because she had been the thing everyone feared and no one fed. But even as the wolf breathed slow under her palm, the sweetness on the wind rose again at the edge of the ruins, stronger than before, and she knew, the way you know weather, that her eye had never once been trying to warn her about the wolf. The miso had run out. That was the small thing that broke the day open. With the guild buying only the herb and the market shelves bare, the seasonings Violet drew from discarded drops could not be replaced with any purse. And in a hungry city, that was no small loss. Roland's face fell as if the sky had cracked. He tucked Violet and Xavier each under one arm and ran for the dungeon at a speed no ordinary road could match to fill the larder himself. Their route skirted a temple lane packed with refugees, and there, in plain daylight at last, Violet saw clearly what her eye had been catching for 3 nights. The starved, thin drifting shapes, wandering the lane without malice, only lost, the hungry dead, drawn up out of their rest by the calamity and hollow with a hunger centuries deep. Roland, following her frozen stare, saw nothing at all but empty air. Only her black eye could hold them. One of them drifted too near a sleeping child, and Roland struck on instinct. His blade passed through the cold shape and met nothing, and the shape did not fall. He struck again, harder, a blow that would have felled anything living. And again, there was only cold air where the edge went through. The strongest man Violet knew stood in a temple lane with a sword that meant nothing, and for the first time she watched raw fear cross his face. But Violet's eye did not stop at what the starved was. It read what it wanted, not blood, not the living, not souls. It wanted only and entirely a meal. It had been hungry for longer than anyone in that lane had been alive, and no one in all that time had ever thought to feed it. She knelt in the cold before the drifting shape, and she took a bowl of the plain food she carried, and she set it down the way you set an offering, and stepped back. The starved bent to it, and it did not thrash, and it did not tear at anything, and it did not vanish into nothing. It ate, and it grew lighter, and then it dissolved into a soft, warm light, and a breath of flowers, and was gone, finally, gently at peace. The killing cold in that stretch of the lane lifted all at once, and the freezing refugees felt warmth crawl back into their hands. Roland and Xavier saw only the boy called Cole kneeling to feed empty air, and then the small light, and the sudden sweetness rising over the lane. Violet knelt there shaking, the thing the whole front line could not touch, the thing that had turned Roland's fear loose in broad daylight. She had just ended with a single bowl. Her useless eye, her useless cooking, they had been the answer the entire time. She could not explain it, not really. She only whispered that they had been hungry a very long time, and that feeding them was the one thing in the world that set them free. The seasoning run stopped mattering the moment word came that the starved had thickened in the upper city, more shapes than before, drifting toward the refugee camps and the market square, and the city guard had thrown a line across them and found, like Roland, that their weapons cut nothing but air. When Violet reached the square, she found the guild's own ranked teams standing there, proud, strong, and utterly helpless before a threat they could not see and could not touch. So she went to work in front of all of them. She moved through the square with her bag of plain food, kneeling, setting down bowl after bowl. One by one, the starved bent to eat. One by one, they grew light and dissolved into that soft glow and the scent of flowers, laid to rest. The living saw only the small boy, the little lights blooming and going out across the stones, and the sweetness rising over the whole square like something out of a prayer. No bodies, no horror, only release. A hush spread out from her as she worked. One of the ranked hunters, shaken past his pride, demanded to know how a nameless drop item boy was doing the one thing his entire team could not. Roland answered for her. He crossed his arms and let the whole square feel the weight of the question before he spoke. And when he did, his voice carried all the way to the far stalls. Because there is not one other soul alive who can. Xavier stood at her back the whole while, aching every time a stranger's eyes landed on her, and fiercely, furiously proud. The two men who had spent every chapter shielding her had become something else entirely, the guards of the small space in which she alone could work. And the rumor ran outward from that square and did not stop. The drop item child, the one the guild expelled, the only answer the capital had to the calamity. It climbed the streets and it climbed the stairs of the guild hall, and it reached at last the ears that had once known her only by the alias Cole, and had thrown her to the dark and walked away. Back at the base, Xavier was talking her down out of another spiral, telling her in his blunt way that what she did in the square was not grim effort, but the exact thing she had been made for, and that leaning on him to run was not weakness, but a talent she was allowed to use. When the runner came pounding at the door, the city was failing, the market was bare, the refugee camps were starving, the healers had emptied the last of their herbal medicine, and the starved kept coming where no blade could stop them. And then, behind the runner, a delegation climbed the street to the base itself, guild officials at its head, and behind them, gaunt and grim, and unable to lift his eyes, the swordsman, Hugo. One of the party that had once used her, dragged her by the hair, and left her ringed by monsters to die. The officials came to the doorway of the girl they had called worthless. Not long ago, these were the hands that had torn up her porter license and turned her out into the street. Now they stood on her step because they had learned what the whole square had already watched, that only the drop item child could feed the starved into peace. Only her eye could turn discarded trash into food and cures. Only she could keep a whole city fed while the calamity ran. They had come to beg the porter they expelled. For one moment, the story turned its eye on Hugo and let the cold sit on the other side of the door for once. He could not make himself look at her. He was remembering, whether he wanted to or not, the weight of her by the hair and the sound of the firewall going up, and how little he had thought of any of it at the time. A porter, a nothing, a thing you spent and forgot. And now the camps were starving and the dead would not stop, and there was no one else in all the capital, no one, but the child he had thrown into the dark. The knowledge of exactly what he had discarded was doing something to his face that no blade ever had. When the words came out of him at last, they came haltingly, through the narration, and never in his own proud voice, that he knew what he and the others had done, that he had no right at all to stand here, but that people were dying, and there was only her. And so he was asking. He, who had decided she was disposable, was asking the girl he threw away to save the very people who let it happen. Xavier stepped between them before Hugo finished, cold as a shut door, remembering every single thing these faces had cost her and ready to send the lot of them back down the street. Roland did not move at all. He only crossed his arms and let the guild stand there and feel the full weight of what they had thrown out, and made them sit in it a long, silent while before anyone spoke. The power in the room had turned completely over, and Violet, who had spent her whole life believing every worthless thing these people had taught her to believe, stood very still and looked at the faces that had taught it to her, now begging at her door. She did not gloat. She did not throw them out. She did not forgive them. She said only that people were starving, and that the starved deserved their rest, and that she would not let the camps go hungry over the question of who had done the asking. What Hugo owed her, and what the guild owed her, and what she would ever do about any of it, she left unspoken, folded away for later. The reckoning the whole story had promised had begun, not as revenge, as this, the ones who cast her out, standing in her light with their pride in ruins, needing her, while the girl they broke decided, without a word, without hurry, entirely in her own time, that she was worth more than their contempt had ever let her be. She turned back toward the kitchen, and the pot, and the work only she could do. Whether the answer to their asking would be mercy or judgment, she was not going to give it tonight. That would wait for the peak still coming. The northern dungeon gave up everything it had at once. For weeks, the city had felt the cold leaking under its doors, and for weeks, nobody could name what was coming. Now it came. The tide of the starved poured up out of the neglected dungeon mouth and spilled into the great square in numbers no watch bell had ever been built to count. Nobody saw them. That was the horror of it. The crowd fleeing behind the line saw only empty air and a killing cold, and ran from a thing they could not point at. Violet saw them. Under the ugly pot helmet tugged low over her face, her left eye had gone flat and black, and to that eye, the square was full. Roland met the front of it alone. He set his heavy sword against the tide and roared, and for a moment the whole world was just the size of him, huge and warm and furious, buying the square minutes it had no right to. His strength was enormous. Everyone in the capital had been raised on stories of exactly how enormous, and Violet watched, with a cold that had nothing to do with the starved, the moment it stopped being enough. Gideon planted himself at the second gate like a wall a mountain had leaned over to build. He did not fall. Families streamed past behind his back, and the tide broke against him and washed on, and the gentle giant who had spent his life sheltering children with useless gifts could not advance one single step. Xavier was everywhere and nowhere. He flickered through the shadows across the whole square, appearing at a stranded old man's elbow. Gone. Standing over a fallen child. Gone. Dropping each of them behind the line and vanishing again before the cold could close. He moved until the silver went gray in his face. Every trip he did not spend standing in front of Violet was tearing him in half, and she could see that too. Then the horned one came. The demon at the head of the wave walked through the hero's best strikes the way a man walks through tall grass. Roland's blade landed clean. The outcome did not change. Gideon threw his whole mountain weight into its path, and the shape simply kept coming, unmarked, unhurried, and wrong in a way the square could feel in its teeth, even if it could not see. Every blow struck true. Nothing struck home. Something big and blind barreled out of the tide and slammed into Violet head-on. 3 months ago, it would have folded her like paper. She braced without thinking, the way she had taught herself to brace under 3 loot bags in the dark, and the hit rang through her, and she stayed standing. She blinked under the pot helmet, almost more startled by that than by the monster. Somewhere along the endless hauling and the endless surviving, her small frame had quietly stopped being the frame of the girl they had ringed with monsters and left to die. She did not have time to marvel at it. She only filed it away, the way she filed everything. She could take a hit now. That might matter. Her left eye warmed and pulled. Over the whole terrible tide, patient as a candle, the same word rose that had once floated over a lump of filth in her palm on her very first day. The eye read the enemy, and the enemy was not an enemy at all. The starved were not here to kill. They were hunger given a shape, once people who had died wanting, and steel had nothing at all to say to hunger. They were starving, and they could be fed. Roland was driven back to the inner line. He planted his feet in front of the crowd and shouted for everyone to fall in behind him and hold. And Violet heard the thing under his voice that she had never once heard there before. It was the voice of a man who knew he was losing. She did not fall in behind him. She stepped forward. Put down the blades," she said, into the middle of grown heroes losing a war. "They are the wrong tool." It was the smallest voice on the field, and it should have been laughable. The cooking pot rode on her shoulder. The wrapped bundle of the offering was hugged against her chest like the only thing she owned. She looked like a lost child carrying dinner into a burning house. Xavier was at her side before she finished the sentence. He caught her arm, and he was not gentle about it, and every word out of him was cold and clipped and frightened straight through. This was not her place. She was too fragile to stand at the front of this. He would take her out, right now, behind the deepest wall he could reach, where the locks were, where he could stand between her and all of it. It was everything he had built over the last weeks poured into one grip on her sleeve. It was protection, and it had finally curdled all the way into a cage. Violet looked up at him from under the horned rim of the helmet, and she was not angry. That was the thing that reached him. She had spent her whole life apologizing for taking up space, and there was no apology in her now at all. She reminded him, quietly, of what the giant had told him. Worry that cages is not love. She did not say it as a weapon. She said it the way you hand something back to a person because it was always theirs. Keeping her safe, she told him, was not the same as keeping her. The safest place in this whole city was right here, at the front, doing the one thing that could actually end this. Everywhere else was just a nicer room to die in. For a moment, Xavier's whole face was a war. She watched him fight the instinct that had run him since the day he joined her, the need to shield her, against the truth he could not out-argue. Shielding her now would cost the city everything, and it would cost him the one person who had ever looked at him and stayed. His grip tightened. Then, slower than anything he had ever done, it opened. Roland heard all of it. He had already made his choice, standing there with a blade that no longer worked, and he made it out loud, the way he made everything. Hold the line off the boy, he bellowed to what was left of the front, throwing one huge arm back toward the crowd. And whatever it is he means to do out there, you let him do it. An S rank ordering his whole line to defend a porter, trusting the boy he had chosen over the sword in his own hands. Nobody argued. There was nothing left in the square that was working better than the last insane idea. Xavier did not take her away. He took her in. His hand closed on her shoulder, and the shadows folded. And instead of teleporting her to safety, he set her down in the one place his every instinct had screamed against, the open center of the failing square, between the broken line and the oncoming dark, exactly where she had asked to be. Then he stepped back to guard her back and let her go to her own battlefield. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, and he did it in half a heartbeat, and it was the moment the tightest thing in him finally learned how to open its hand. Violet knelt on the cold stones and set the pot down in the middle of the end of the world. She did not hurry, and she did not fumble, and every eye that could bear to look was on the smallest person present doing the strangest thing anyone in that square had ever seen. She unwrapped the offering, the food only her eye could ever have named, the ugly otherworld things the bright world had walked straight past for 1,000 years. She set out the miso. She got the fire under the pot and the broth going, and the warm smell of it began to spread out from her knees across the stones into the cold toward the tide. Her hands did not shake. That surprised her more than anything. She stirred the miso through the broth until it dissolved the way it was supposed to, added the curry block her eye had once read out of a lump of dungeon filth, and worked it in slow, tasting the steam, adjusting it the way she had taught herself alone on a riverbank, with nobody watching and nobody expecting anything of her. She was cooking, in the middle of the end of the world, with a demon turning toward her and heroes losing a war at her back. She was simply, carefully cooking, the way she had every quiet evening of her strange life, and for the first time, all of it was pointed at something that could not be done any other way. She was not making a last stand. She was setting a table for everything the starved died wanting and never had. A hot pot in the dark, a bowl of something warm handed to a person who had been forgotten. The exact tenderness the world had denied them and had denied her, laid out now on the ground in the open where the dead could finally reach it. The first of the starved reached the steam, told plainly, because there was nothing else to tell. They slowed. The killing cold that had rolled ahead of the tide eased where the warm smell touched it, the way a held breath eases. No bodies, no horror, only a hush, spreading out from a girl and a pot into a hunger centuries deep, and beginning, for the first time in all that time, to answer it. The horned one felt its wave falter. The demon turned from the heroes it could not be hurt by, and it fixed, with a whole attention that made the air go thick, on the one small figure at the pot. It had walked through S-rank steel without a scratch. It knew, the way hunger always knows the hand that would feed it out of existence, exactly who the real threat in this square was. And it came for her directly. Roland and Gideon threw themselves into its path. They could not stop it. They had proven that already in front of the whole city. But two of the strongest men alive, spending everything, could slow it. one grinding step at a time, and one step at a time was suddenly worth more than all their victories put together, because every step they stole was a breath Violet did not have to fight for. She did not watch the demon come. She trusted the wall of them at her back, the way she had never trusted anything, and she kept working. And then she did the thing that stopped every hunter's heart in the square. She lifted her small voice over the roar and called a name into the dark. Out of the ruined dungeon mouth, something answered. It came low and gray and enormous, and the ground knew it before the eyes did. The ranked hunters holding the line felt the old, buried part of themselves go cold and still, because every one of them had grown up on the story, and every one of them had been told the story was over. Fenrir, the wolf out of the deep myth, hunted to a legend, thought extinct for 1,000 years. A bounty no hunter alive had ever dared to claim. It had not come for a bounty. It had come for a girl who once crouched in a collapsed stall and shared her millet dumplings with a starving thing everyone else would have run a blade through. Kindness had summoned it, not power, not a command. She had never had power to command anything in her life. She had only ever had the one thing the whole world kept calling worthless, and it turned out that the one thing was enough to call a legend up out of 1,000 years of silence. Fenrir set itself between Violet and the Horned One and met the demon head-on. For the first time since the tide began, the wave was held on both sides. The wolf held the front, the heroes held the flank. And in the small warm pocket of held breath they bought her, the girl at the pot bowed her head and went back to the work only she could do. She fed them. One by one, the starved came into the warmth, and one by one, she gave them the thing they had died wanting. There is only the gentle way to say what happened next, because the gentle way is the true one. They did not fall. Nothing struck them. They simply grew still, the way a fever breaks, and then they grew light, and then they were gone, dissolving one after another into a soft, warm glow that rose off the cold stones and faded into nothing. Where each of them had been, the killing cold lifted, and in its place, impossibly, in the middle of a war, there was the faint, clean smell of flowers. She whispered to them as she worked. Small things. It's all right. You waited long enough. Here, the kind of nothing you say to someone who has been hungry too long to believe the meal is real. Nobody had ever said it to them. Nobody had ever said it to her either, and she said it to them all the same. And the square filled, breath by breath, with warm light and the smell of a spring nobody in the capital had felt in weeks. Her useless eye, her useless cooking, the gifts they had laughed her out of a guild for, laid end to end, in the worst hour the city had ever known. They were turning out to be the only thing in the whole bright world that could reach the dead and let them rest. Fire came down the far end of the square like a second sun deciding to land. Scarlet walked in out of the smoke at the worst possible moment for the demon, and the best possible one for everyone else. The Crimson Witch, a legend the city spoke of the way it spoke of weather. It had survived, cool and teasing even now, even here, as if she had strolled in late to a party she fully intended to end. She had waited years for this. The fire she was carrying was the once-in-years kind, the sort of power a person only gets to spend a handful of times in a whole life, and she had been saving it for exactly the sort of thing that had come up out of the north. She held it back off the crowd with a control that made hardened hunters flinch, and she aimed it where the offering had left the demon exposed, because that was the turn. Even her fire could not have ended the starved, and she knew it, and she did not waste a spark trying. Hunger does not burn. But the Horned One was not hunger the way the starved were hunger. The Horned One was fed by the tide, and Violet's offering had been quietly taking the tide away, one soft light at a time, until the demon at the head of the wave stood cut off from the thing that fed it, exposed, alone, and for the first time since it climbed out of the dark, reachable. Fenrir drove it. Scarlet's fire pinned it. Roland and Gideon closed the last of the distance, and between the wolf out of myth, the witch and her once-in-years flame, and the two men who had refused to fall, the demon was ended. Told the only way it needs telling, the pressure that had been crushing the capital simply lifted. The wrongness in the air, the weight in the teeth, the cold under every door, all of it let go at once, like a held breath finally released across the whole city. The Horned One did not fall so much as it stopped being there to feel, and the square, which had been the loudest place in the world, went suddenly, ringingly quiet. Into that quiet, the last of the warm lights was still rising off the stones, one small soul at a time, out of a cooking pot tended by the smallest person on the field. The city came out of its doorways into a square that smelled of spring. They had run from a cold they could not see, and now they crept back toward a warmth they could not explain. And every one of them, ranked hunter and gutter child alike, found the same thing waiting at the center of it. A small figure in an ugly horned pot helmet, kneeling by a cooking pot, still working, laying the last of the drifting lights to rest one at a time, as if the war were somebody else's news, and this bowl were the only thing that mattered in the world. To all of them, she was still the boy Porter Cole, the nameless drop item boy, the one the guild had thrown out. And into that silence, inside the peak and not after it, came the crawlback. They came ragged and gray, and out of every answer they had ever leaned on, the same faces that had begged at her door the evening before, come now to ask again where the whole city could see. The guild officials who had torn up her license and fed her to the dark, and behind them, hollowed out, unable at first to lift his eyes, the gray-robed swordsman who had once dragged her across the ground by the hair. They did not come with contempt this time. They came because the offering at the center of that square was the only thing left in the whole world that could save the people they were supposed to be responsible for, and they knew it. And they had to walk to the very table they had mocked and stand at the rim of it and ask. The crowd saw it happen. That was the part no one in the square would ever forget. The officials who ran the guild and the man from the party that had erased her, on their knees at the edge of a porter's cooking pot in front of the whole city, needing the one person they had all agreed was worth nothing. His plea came out halting and low, and it is enough to say what it was without performing it. The man who had thrown her away asked the girl he threw away for food and for mercy and for the saving of the very people he had once been so proud to stand above. Everything the story had promised, arriving at last on its knees at the rim of her pot. Violet did not turn to him. She was not being cruel. She was simply not finished. There were still lights on the cold stones, still hungry dead who had waited 1,000 years, and they came first. The living debt could stand at the edge of the warmth and wait its turn, the way she had waited a whole life for hers. She set down one more bowl. She laid one more soul to rest. She let the man who had dragged her by the hair stand at the rim of her table and watch her save him, and she gave him nothing yet, and the nothing was louder than any answer. The last of the warm light faded. The smell of flowers settled over the square, like a blessing nobody there had earned. And in the enormous quiet that followed, with the whole exhausted city turned toward the smallest person in it, someone near the front finally found their voice and asked the question no one had ever once bothered to ask the porter they discarded. They asked her who she really was. They asked the boy at the pot his name. Violet knelt in the fading light with the empty bowl in her hands and did not answer that either. Not yet. That answer, and the answer she owed the man on his knees behind her, and the reckoning the whole square could feel hanging in the warm air, would all wait for the same thing, the last breath still coming. For a long moment after the quiet came, nobody in the square moved. Then Violet reached into the satchel at her hip and drew out the ugliest thing in it, a gray knotted lump the size of a fist, the kind of drop item that fell out of a monster and got kicked into a gutter because no one alive could tell it from filth. She had carried it for weeks without knowing why. She only knew she had not been able to throw it away. Her left eye warmed and went black, and the word rose over the lump in her palm, patient as a candle, the way it always had. Not poison, not stone, medicine. The kind that closed a wound the healers in this city did not have the skill to close, brewed from a thing the whole bright world had stepped over on its way to somewhere it thought mattered more. There were people bleeding on the stones. The calamity was over, but it had not left cleanly, and along the edges of the square lay the ones the starved had touched before the cold lifted, the ones the priests were kneeling beside with nothing left to give. Violet stood up. Her knees ached from a whole day at the pot. She walked the ugly lump to the nearest of them, a woman with a gray face and a hunter's ruined arm, and she knelt again, and she went to work. She did not announce it. She never did. She crushed the medicine into water and warmed it and got it past the woman's lips, one careful sip at a time, and the gray went out of that face, and the arm that should have been lost was, slowly, not lost. The woman stared at her the way people had been staring at her all day, like she was a thing out of a story, and Violet only ducked her head and moved to the next one. Then the next. A boy with a leg gone cold, an old watchman who had stopped breathing right. She read what each of them needed off the drops the whole world had thrown away, and she gave it, and one by one, the rows on the stones stopped being a place where people died. Roland walked the rows behind her, that enormous man made suddenly gentle, lifting the wounded so she could reach them, saying nothing, watching the smallest person on the field do the last thing no one wearing his rank had ever once been able to do. The crowd watched too. They had watched her end a calamity with a cooking pot. Now they watched her walk their dying back from the dark with a lump of trash, and the last of them who had ever called her useless felt the word turn to ash in his mouth. She emptied the satchel. She emptied herself. And when the last wound was closed, Violet finally set down the bowl and let her shoulders drop and turned around. They were still there, kneeling at the rim of her pot, exactly where they had been when she made them wait. The guild officials who had torn up her porter license and signed the paper that fed her to the dark. The gray road swordsman, Hugo, hollowed gray. The man who had once dragged her across the ground by the hair. Behind him, the fire mage, Alicia, whose sneer had bought her nothing at all. And the healer, Miles, the soft-spoken one, whose false kindness had run out at last with nowhere left to hide. Starving, every one of them, needing the exact 3 things they had once decided she was too worthless to be given: food, healing, and a chance to be told they were worth keeping. The whole square was watching. That was the part that mattered. Not a back room, not a private erasure in some office with the door shut, the way they had done it to her. The crowd, the ranked hunters, the city watch, the gutter children, all of it turned toward the pot in the gold light, so that whatever happened next happened where nothing could ever be denied or rewritten. Hugo lifted his eyes to her. It cost him everything he had left. And then the man who had never in his life been able to say a true thing said the truest one he had, out loud, in front of the city that had once cheered for him. It is enough to say what he said without performing it. He named it, all of it. The bait, the firewall, the abandonment in the dark, the license torn up on a lie. The girl thrown away because throwing her away was easier than being brave. He did not soften it, and he did not ask to be spared. He laid the whole ugly account down at the rim of her pot and left it there, naked, for everyone to hear. And for one breath, behind his eyes, the wheel came all the way around. He was seeing it, finally, too late, the shape of what he had held in his hands and called garbage. He had thrown away the one person in the whole world who could have saved him, and she had gone and saved him anyway, and there was no bottom to how small that made him. The man who had measured her worth in the copper of a porter's wage understood, in that one breath, that he had never once been able to afford her. The fire mage did not lift her face. The sneer that had followed Violet through every cold morning, the little cruelties dealt out for sport because a porter was a thing and not a person, all of it had bought Alicia exactly nothing, and she knelt in the ash of it and could not find one word. Beside her, the healer, Miles, the soft-spoken one who had always played the reasonable friend, tried the old trick one last time. He reached for the smooth apology, the easy forgiveness bought cheap, the help with the hook hidden in it, and it died in his mouth. There was nothing left to trade with. The girl at the pot could see straight through him with an eye that read what things truly were, and he knew it. And the false kindness fell off him and left only a small frightened man with empty hands. There had been 3 months of it, a whole winter of learning she could be discarded the instant she stopped hauling enough to be worth her bread. And here were the ones who had taught her that lesson, kneeling to unlearn it, needing her to be exactly the generous thing they had spent so long insisting she could not afford to be. Roland shifted his weight beside her. He would have backed any word she said. If she had named a judgment, the strongest man in the capital would have carried it out, and the city would not have lifted a hand to stop her, and every soul in that square knew it. The vengeance was there. It was hers. The whole story had owed it to her, and here it was, on its knees, offered up. Violet looked at them a long moment. Then she spoke, and she did not whisper it, and the apology that had lived in her voice her whole life was simply not in it anymore. I know what you did, all of it. Her voice carried clean across the stones. You decided I was worth nothing, and you threw me away to keep yourselves safe. A breath, held, released. And I am going to feed you anyway. You and every person you were supposed to protect. Not because you earned it. Not because you deserve one warm thing from me. She let them hear it land. Because I am not the thing you decided I was. And I never was. This is mine to give. And I am choosing it standing up, with my eyes open, so that not one of you can ever pretend I was too small to say no. She turned to the pot. She lifted the ladle, and she fed them. From the same pot that had just ended the world's hunger, she filled a bowl and set it in front of the man who had dragged her by the hair, and she filled another and another, and she did not look away, and she did not gloat, and the naming of what they had done hung in the air over every bowl she poured, so that the mercy could never once be mistaken for weakness. It was not a debt she was too frightened to collect. It was a judgment she was finally large enough to hand down. There was a small thing she did in the middle of it that only she understood. Once, on the worst morning of her life, Hugo had flung 2 gold at her feet, like she was a beggar he wanted gone. An overpayment made out of contempt. Coin thrown to prove he could not be bothered to count. She had carried those 2 clean coins ever since, unspent. An old bruise she had never known how to put down. Now, in the gold light, She set them on the stones at the rim of the pot beside his bowl, squared, paid back to the last copper. She would not carry even that much of him into the rest of her life. Let the account close all the way to zero, on her side of it, chosen and clean. The healer wept into his hands. The fire mage could not lift her face, and the crowd, packed to the doors of the square, watched the girl they had all agreed was worthless choose, out loud, in the light, to be kinder than every one of them had ever been to her, and understood that they were watching the strongest thing they would see in their lives, and it had nothing to do with the rank. Some of them had cheered when the porter was thrown out. They would carry the shame of that cheer a long time. She did not need them to. That was the whole point of doing it standing up. In the quiet after the last bowl was poured, a memory came up in her the way the words over the drop items came up, patient and unbidden. Her mother's voice from before any of this, from a kitchen, and a warmth she had almost let herself forget. Everyone is needed in this world, no matter their skill. Value yourself for the sake of the people who love you. She had heard that line 1,000 times as a small girl, and she had believed exactly half of it. She had believed that other people were needed. She had never once, not for a single day of her life, believed the second half was about her. Worth was a thing you bought with usefulness, and the day you ran out of uses was the day they threw you in the dark. And she had known that the way you know weather, all the way down. And now she stood in the middle of a saved city, and every soul in it was alive because of her. The useless eye no one wanted had read the hunger of the dead. The useless boy no one kept had cooked the world back from the edge. The trash she could not throw away had closed the wounds no healer could reach. Her mother's words were not a comfort anymore. Standing in that square, they were a fact. Plain, provable, witnessed by a whole city. She had been the one irreplaceable person the entire time, and she had spent her whole life certain she was the one who could be spared. The wound did not close all at once. It closed the way a held breath finally lets go, quiet and total, and a long time coming. Her hand drifted to the storage bag at her hip, to the one thing in it she had carried into the end of the world and never once drawn. The old thin blade, a plain, dull, ugly sword she had pulled out of a heap of forgotten junk months ago, that every appraiser and every merchant had glanced at and priced as scrap. Her black eye had read it the first day and told her the truth the whole bright world had walked straight past. It was a legend, a weapon out of an age nobody living remembered, thrown into a pile of trash because no one had bothered to look closely enough to see what it was. She had kept it, not to swing it. She barely knew how to hold it. She had kept it because the first time she read that word over a discarded blade, something in her chest had gone very still, and she had not understood why until exactly now. The world threw a legend into the trash because it looked plain, and it kept its worth quiet, and it did not announce itself. The world had done the same thing to a girl carrying 3 bags in the dark. Neither of them had ever been worthless. They had only been unlooked at, and the eye that could not fight, the eye they had all called useless, was the one eye in the world that had ever bothered to look. She left the blade in the bag. She did not need to draw it to know what it meant. It had already said the only thing she needed it to say. Xavier was at her shoulder. He had learned, on the hardest day of his life, that the love which trusts is the love that protects, and he stood there now and let her stand on her own, which was the whole of what he had to give her, and the best of it. Roland was on her other side, that huge warm man, proud past any word he owned. And at the edge of the gold light stood Gideon, the giant who had once crouched down in a market to tell a knot of children born with useless skills that no skill was ever worthless, watching the smallest of them prove him right in front of the world. They were her family. She had one now. That was the thing the frightened porter carrying 3 bags in the dark had never dared to want out loud. Somewhere near the front of the crowd, a voice found itself. Not a guild official, not a master, not anyone with a paper or a rank or a right to her, just a person in a saved city who had watched all of it and needed, the way you need water, to know. They asked the small figure at the pot the question no one had ever once bothered to ask the porter they discarded. They asked her who she really was. They asked her name. Violet reached up with both hands and lifted the ugly single-horned pot helmet off her head, the disguise and the tool and the shield she had hidden inside for so long, and she set it down on the stones beside the pot, and she straightened and let them see her. Not the boy porter, not the nameless drop item child. A slight girl of 16 with a clear blue eye and a black one, standing at the center of the world she had saved. "Violet," she said. "My name is Violet." The word moved out through the square in a spreading hush. The city that had used a boy called Cole as bait, that had erased him and framed him and thrown him to the dark, learned in a single breath that he had never existed, that she was a girl, that she had a name, and it was Violet, named for a flower her mother had loved. and that she had been worth everything from the very first day they decided she was worth nothing. She had wanted one thing, under all the other wanting, since before the story ever started, to be known once as herself, to be seen and kept, not for what she could haul or read or cook, but simply because she was hers and worth the keeping. She had spent 3 months certain that the moment anyone saw the girl under the porter, they would find one more reason to throw her back. She had never once believed she would get to be Violet out loud and be kept anyway. Roland was the first to say it back. That huge, blunt man who had picked her out of a bat swarm on the worst night of her life and decided, before he knew a single useful thing about her, that she was worth saving, only said her name, low, like he had been waiting the whole story to be allowed to. Just the one word, Violet. And Xavier said it after him, gruff, his ears going red, the way they always did when the care slipped out past the scowling. And it was the first time he had let himself say it where the world could hear. Then the square said it. The word went across the stones the way the warm light had gone, one row at a time, a whole city learning a name and giving it back. No one asked her to prove she deserved it. No one weighed her. They simply said Violet and meant it, and let her be a person and not a use. She stood in the middle of it and let it be true. And, for the first time in her life, she let it be enough. The wolf lifted its head. Fenrir, out of a myth 1,000 years dead, come for a girl who had once shared millet dumplings with a starving thing everyone else had met with a blade. It lay at the edge of the warm light with its ancient eyes half open, and it watched her the way the rest of them watched her, and it was not going anywhere. The family drew in close as the light went long, Roland with his hand resting light on her head the way he had that first day at the guild, like he was still a little amazed she was real. Xavier close on her other side, not caging her now, just near, which was the whole of what he had learned to be. Gideon, a great gentle shape against the amber sky. The horror was ended. The reckoning was given in the open, on her own terms. The name was spoken and believed. Every loop the wound had ever opened had at last been closed. But Violet's black eye was still her black eye, and it had read more than words over trash in its time. It had read the shape of things that walked past unseen. And standing in the quiet of the saved square, she could not quite let go of one small cold fact that did not fit. The starved had climbed out of the northern dungeon in numbers no dungeon had ever held. The dead do not wake in their thousands by accident. Something had reached down into the dark and opened it. Somewhere out past the edge of this warm and grateful city, an unseen hand had set the whole Calamity in motion and had watched it come and had never once shown its face. The thing that drove the tide was still out there. Whatever it wanted, it had not gotten it, and it would come again. She did not say it aloud, not tonight. Tonight the light was gold and her family was close, and a myth was sleeping at her feet, and a whole city knew her name. Violet, the girl the world had called useless, the one they had all agreed could be thrown away, stood at the center of the place she had saved, chosen, and choosing, needed, and, for the first time in her life, believing it. The story was not over, but this part of it, the part where a discarded girl learned exactly what she had been worth all along, ended there, in the warm light, on her name.